The New Year's party at Jessica's parents' house was supposed to be a pleasant tradition, something warm and simple. We'd done this every year since we started dating. Drive out to her hometown about an hour and a half away, celebrate with her family, and head back late at night. The night itself went fine, at least on the surface. Her parents were polite, her siblings were loud, and the food was decent. Nothing out of the ordinary. But there was this tension in the air between Jessica and me that I couldn't quite shake. It started small, little comments here and there. She'd nudge me to talk more, ask about her family's plans, or chime in with something witty during their constant banter. I tried, I really did, but Jessica always had this way of making me feel like I wasn't enough in social situations, like I was missing some invisible cue she wanted me to pick up on. By the time we were ready to leave, she wasn't saying much, but her silence spoke louder than words. We stepped outside into the cold night air, and I carried our small bag of leftovers to the car. The roads were wet from a mix of rain and snow that had been falling on and off all evening. Jessica climbed into the passenger seat and immediately pulled out her phone, scrolling with a tight expression. The air felt heavy, the kind of silence that sits in your chest and presses down until you can't take it anymore. I started the car, and as I adjusted the GPS, she finally spoke up. "You barely said 2 words to my dad tonight. What's with you?" Her tone was sharp, but I tried to keep my cool. "I was just tired, Jess. It's been a long week. I didn't mean to come off that way." She let out a short, bitter laugh. "Right. Tired. You've always got an excuse." I didn't respond immediately, focusing instead on getting us out of the driveway. Her parents lived on a quiet street, but the icy patches on the asphalt made me grip the wheel a little tighter. The tension in the car was unbearable, though, and after a minute of silence, she pressed again. "Do you even like spending time with my family? Because it really doesn't feel like it sometimes." "Of course I do," I said, my voice a little sharper now. "Why are you making such a big deal out of this?" She shook her head and looked back down at her phone. "Forget it." I knew I should have just let it go. I should have focused on the road, let the moment pass. But something about the way she said it, like she'd already written me off, set me off too. I felt a flicker of anger rising, but I swallowed it down and gripped the wheel harder. The windshield wipers scraped against the glass, smearing the wet snow into streaks. We'd been driving for about 10 minutes when the first signs of unease hit me. It wasn't anything dramatic, just this sense that something was off. The dark road ahead seemed narrower than I remembered, and the faint glow of streetlights reflected oddly on the slick pavement. It was quiet. Too quiet, except for the rhythmic swish of the wipers and the low hum of the engine. Jessica shifted in her seat, crossing her arms. Her silence felt like a physical wall between us. "You could have at least tried," she said suddenly, her voice breaking the stillness. "You didn't even ask my mom about her job. She wanted to talk to you, but you barely looked at her." I sighed, frustration bubbling to the surface. "Jess, I wasn't trying to ignore anyone, okay? I don't know what you want from me." "I want you to act like you care," she snapped, finally turning to face me. Her eyes flashed with anger, and for a split second I glanced at her instead of the road. That's when it happened. A faint flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, a car approaching from the opposite direction. My heart skipped a beat as I realized I'd drifted too close to the center line. I yanked the wheel back to my side, but the tires skidded slightly on the wet road. "What the hell are you doing?" Jessica yelled, gripping the armrest. "I've got it," I said, my voice tight with panic. But the moment passed, and the other car sped by without incident. I tried to shake off the nerves, but the pounding in my chest wouldn't subside. Jessica didn't say anything after that. She just sat there, tense and rigid, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. The silence returned, heavier than before, and I felt my grip on the wheel loosen slightly, though my knuckles were still white. We were barely 30 minutes into the drive, but something told me this night was far from over. The tension in the car was suffocating. Jessica hadn't said a word since I'd skidded, and honestly, I didn't blame her. I could feel her frustration radiating off her, her crossed arms and sharp exhale saying everything she wasn't. I kept my eyes on the road, but my mind was racing. I kept replaying the last hour, the little jabs, the silence, the fight. My jaw was tight, and my chest felt heavy, like I couldn't get a full breath. The wet snow was turning into sleet, making the roads even worse. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up, smearing water and slush in wide arcs. Visibility was garbage, and I had to squint to make out the faint, reflective paint of the road lines. I didn't realize how fast I was going until I saw a green highway sign flash by. The turnoff for the interstate was coming up. "Slow down," Jessica said quietly, but her voice had an edge to it. "I'm not going that fast," I shot back, but I eased off the gas anyway. The tires hissed against the wet pavement, the car feeling unsteady beneath us. "Can we just get home in one piece?" she said, her tone sharper now. "Yeah, I'm trying, Jessica," I snapped. The words were out before I could stop them, and the weight in my chest grew heavier. This was spiraling, and I couldn't stop it. I merged onto the interstate, gripping the wheel tighter. The highway was emptier than I expected, just a few taillights ahead and the occasional oncoming headlights in the opposite lane. The sleet was relentless now, tapping against the windshield like tiny pellets. The sound filled the silence between us. Jessica finally turned toward me, her arms still crossed. "Why do you always do this?" "Do what?" I said, keeping my eyes on the road. "Act like I'm the bad guy when I just want you to care. Like tonight. You couldn't even fake it for a few hours." Her voice was strained, but her words cut deep. "I was there, wasn't I? I drove out here, didn't I?" My voice was rising now, the frustration spilling over. "God, Jessica, why is it never enough?" "Maybe because you don't try," she shot back. "You're always so wrapped up in your own world, you don't even see it." I opened my mouth to respond, but a pair of headlights appeared ahead, veering slightly into our lane. My heart jumped, and I reflexively jerked the wheel to the right. The tires skidded, the car fishtailing on the slick surface. "Watch out!" Jessica screamed, grabbing the dashboard. I overcorrected, pulling the wheel left too hard. The car lurched violently, the rear end swinging out. For a split second, everything was chaos. The screech of tires, Jessica's panicked cries, and the blinding glare of the oncoming headlights. And then it happened. The impact wasn't like in the movies. There was no slow-motion crash, no dramatic music. It was fast, brutal, and deafening. The other car clipped us on the passenger side, spinning us across the icy road. I felt the jolt slam through my body as the airbags deployed, my chest and face slamming into the cushion with bone-jarring force. The car spun once, twice, before crashing sideways into the guardrail. The screech of metal on metal was unbearable, and then everything went still. For a moment, I couldn't move. My ears were ringing, my chest felt like it was caved in, and the acrid smell of burnt rubber and deployed airbags filled the car. I gasped for air, trying to process what had just happened. "Jessica?" I croaked, my voice barely audible. No response. "Jessica!" I yelled this time, twisting in my seat despite the pain shooting through my side. The passenger seat was crushed inward, the metal frame warped from the impact. Jessica's head was slumped forward, her hair matted with blood. "Jessica, wake up." My hands fumbled with the seatbelt, the latch refusing to budge. Panic clawed at my throat as I reached out, shaking her shoulder. She didn't move. The distant wail of sirens broke through the ringing in my ears. I screamed her name again, over and over, my voice cracking with desperation. By the time the paramedics arrived, I was pulled from the wreckage, dazed and covered in blood that wasn't mine. They worked on Jessica for what felt like an eternity, but I already knew. I knew the moment I saw her lifeless body that it was too late. She was pronounced dead at the scene. I remember sitting on the cold asphalt, staring at the mangled car, the flashing red and blue lights painting the night in eerie colors. My hands shook uncontrollably, and my mind was numb. This was my fault. All of it. If I'd just kept my mouth shut, if I'd paid more attention, if I'd just stopped. That New Year's Eve was supposed to be just another night, another drive home. Instead, It became the night I lost Jessica forever. I've replayed that moment 1,000 times in my head. But nothing can change what happened. Nothing ever will. We had planned this New Year's trip for months. Me, Dan, and our girlfriends, Allison and Sarah. We rented a small cabin in the Colorado mountains, far away from the city noise, hoping for a quiet, cozy start to the year. It wasn't anything fancy, just 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a living room with a stone fireplace that gave it a rustic vibe. The rental ad had boasted about the authentic mountain experience, and we were all excited about the idea of ringing in the new year surrounded by snow and stars. The drive up there was longer than expected. Snow had started falling in the late afternoon, and the winding roads were slick. By the time we reached the cabin, it was already dark, and we were exhausted. But the place looked perfect. A blanket of snow covered the yard, and the tall pines surrounding the house made it feel secluded and peaceful. The inside was even better. Warm wood paneling, soft couches, and a stack of firewood by the fireplace. It felt like stepping into one of those holiday postcards. We spent the first hour unpacking and settling in. Dan took charge of starting the fire while Allison and Sarah unloaded the groceries we'd brought. I fiddled with the thermostat, which wasn't working great, but we figured the fireplace would keep things warm enough. Once the fire was crackling, the cabin quickly filled with a cozy heat and we all relaxed. Dinner was simple, just sandwiches and chips, since none of us felt like cooking after the long drive. Afterward, we played a few rounds of cards and talked about our plans for the next day, hiking, maybe sledding, and of course, plenty of hot cocoa. It wasn't until around 11 p.m. that Dan mentioned he wasn't feeling great. He kept rubbing his temples and said he had a splitting headache. We all teased him about drinking too much coffee earlier, but he insisted it was different. Allison offered him some painkillers from her bag, but he waved her off, saying he just needed some water and maybe some fresh air. I joked that he'd better not bail on the hike tomorrow, and he laughed it off, but his face was pale, and his usual energy seemed off. About half an hour later, Sarah started complaining about nausea. She said the room felt too warm and went to sit by the front door for a bit. I chalked it up to being tired and dehydrated. None of us had eaten much since lunch, and the altitude was higher than we were used to. I started feeling a bit off too. Not sick exactly, but lightheaded, like I'd stood up too fast. Dan was still on the couch, looking worse by the minute, and when I asked if he wanted to head to bed early, he barely responded. That was when I noticed how shallow his breathing had become. Allison said something about the fire, wondering if the smoke was getting trapped because the room smelled kind of strange. I checked the fireplace but didn't see anything unusual, just glowing logs and the occasional flicker of ash. I told her it was probably just the smell of the wood burning, but deep down, I felt uneasy. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. A little after midnight, things took a turn. Dan suddenly slumped forward, spilling his water bottle onto the carpet. Sarah screamed and we all rushed over. He was still breathing but completely unresponsive, his skin clammy and cold despite the heat from the fire. Panic set in. I tried shaking him awake while Allison called his name over and over. Sarah started dialing 911, her hands shaking so much she almost dropped her phone. That's when I noticed my own vision blurring, and a wave of dizziness hit me so hard I had to sit down. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get a full breath, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. It was like the air in the room had suddenly gotten heavier, and every instinct in me was screaming that we needed to get out of there. Sarah was still on the phone with 911, her voice high-pitched and frantic as I forced myself to stand. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and my head was swimming, but I grabbed Dan by the arms and tried to drag him toward the door. "We need to get outside," I managed to say, though my throat felt tight and every word came out in a gasp. Allison ran to open the front door, letting in a blast of freezing air that cut through the suffocating warmth of the cabin. Sarah helped me haul Dan out onto the porch. The cold hit him, and for a moment I thought he stirred, but his head just lolled to the side. I laid him down on the snow-covered ground, my breath coming in sharp, ragged gulps. The fresh air was helping a little, but I was still dizzy, and my chest ached like I'd been running for miles. Sarah handed the phone to Allison and crouched next to me. "They said help is on the way," she said, her voice trembling. "It's going to be okay." But looking at Dan, pale and unmoving, I wasn't so sure. His lips had a faint bluish tint, and his breaths were shallow and uneven. I pressed 2 fingers to his neck, trying to find a pulse, and it was there, but weak. Allison came back with a blanket and draped it over him, her face pale with worry. "Could it be carbon monoxide?" Sarah asked suddenly. Her words cut through the fog in my head and everything clicked. The headache, the nausea, the dizziness, it all lined up. And the fireplace. I hadn't checked the chimney before lighting it. What if it was blocked? What if the cabin was filling with CO, and we hadn't even realized it? "I think she's right," I said, my voice shaky. "We've been breathing it in. We need to stay outside." Minutes felt like hours as we waited for the ambulance. My head was still pounding, and Sarah sat with her arms wrapped around herself, rocking slightly as she tried to keep calm. Allison paced back and forth, biting her nails. I kept checking Dan's pulse, willing him to hang on. Finally, we heard the wail of sirens cutting through the stillness of the mountains. Red and blue lights lit up the snowy trees as paramedics and firefighters rushed toward us. One of the paramedics knelt beside Dan, checking his vitals, while another started asking us questions. I could barely focus on what they were saying, but I caught words like carbon monoxide poisoning and hyperbaric chamber. They loaded Dan onto a stretcher and into the ambulance, then checked the rest of us with a handheld CO monitor. The readings were high enough to make them insist we get checked out at the hospital too. One of the firefighters went inside the cabin and came back shaking his head. "The chimney's completely blocked," he said grimly. "All the smoke and CO were venting back into the house. You're lucky you got out when you did." At the hospital, they put us all on oxygen, and the doctor confirmed that we were suffering from mild carbon monoxide poisoning. Dan, however, was in much worse shape. They rushed him into a hyperbaric chamber to flood his body with oxygen, and the doctor warned us there could be long-term effects on his brain if he didn't recover quickly. We spent the rest of New Year's Eve in the waiting room, staring at the clock as it ticked past midnight. There was no celebration, no countdown, just silence and the sterile smell of the hospital. Around 3 a.m., a nurse came out to tell us Dan was stable but still unconscious. The relief was overwhelming, but it didn't erase the fear that had settled deep in my chest. Dan woke up the next day, groggy and confused, but alive. The doctors said he was lucky. A few more minutes in the cabin, and it could have been fatal. The owner of the rental cabin was later charged with negligence for failing to maintain the property, but that didn't make us feel any better about what had happened. I still think about that trip every time I see a fireplace or rent a cabin. We were so close to losing everything that night, and it was all because of something we couldn't see or smell. Now, I never travel without a portable carbon monoxide detector, and I double-check every place I stay. It's not the kind of lesson you ever want to learn the hard way. A couple of years ago, I decided to ring in the new year at a well-known club in New York City. It was one of those places everyone raves about with flashy lights, great music, and the promise of a night to remember. My friends and I had planned it for weeks. We bought our tickets in advance, made dinner reservations nearby, and even coordinated our outfits like we were heading to some red carpet event. It felt like the perfect way to start the year. Carefree and fun. When we got there, the line outside was already massive, stretching around the block. The bouncers were doing their best to keep things moving, but people were restless, shoving and sneaking past each other. Still, the energy was exciting. It was cold out, but no one seemed to care. Everyone was buzzing with anticipation for the countdown and fireworks. I remember joking with my friend Chris about how we'd better get inside before midnight, or risk celebrating with frozen toes. Once we were finally in, the atmosphere hit like a wall. Blaring music, flashing strobe lights, and that sticky smell of spilled drinks and sweat. It was packed, but not in a way that felt overwhelming at first. We grabbed a round of drinks and scoped out the place. There were a couple of levels, with a huge dance floor in the middle, a bar on one side, and an outdoor patio upstairs where they promised a killer view of the midnight fireworks. Things started off pretty normal. We danced for a bit, laughed at some over-the-top New Year's hats people were wearing, and mingled with a few strangers who seemed nice enough. But as the night wore on, more and more people poured in. By around 11, it was hard to move without bumping into someone. Getting to the bar for another drink became a full-on battle, and the staff behind the counter looked overwhelmed. The crowd was getting louder, rowdier. I started noticing little things that felt off. A group of guys near the bar was arguing, their voices cutting through the music. The security guards looked stressed, glancing around like they were trying to keep tabs on everything at once but couldn't. At one point, a waitress brushed past me, muttering something under her breath about how it was way over capacity. I didn't think much of it at the time. Clubs are supposed to feel packed, right? But there was this tiny knot of unease forming in my stomach. Around 11:30, we decided to head upstairs to the patio. It was supposed to be the highlight of the night, ringing in the new year with a view of the city skyline and fireworks. The staircase leading up was already crowded, with people shuffling forward in a slow, awkward line. It didn't feel dangerous, just annoying. Someone behind us was complaining about how long it was taking, but most people were laughing, chatting, or glued to their phones. When we finally made it to the patio, it was clear the place was completely overwhelmed. There was barely any space to stand, let alone move around. People were pressed shoulder to shoulder, some leaning over the edge to take selfies with the city lights in the background. The air felt thicker up there, like the energy of the crowd was shifting into something less fun and more frantic. I remember thinking we should probably head back downstairs, but before I could say anything, there was a loud noise. Maybe someone dropping a glass, maybe something heavier. It startled the crowd, and for a split second, everyone froze. Then, almost as if on cue, a ripple of movement started. People surged toward the railing, trying to see what had happened, and others moved in the opposite direction, bumping into each other in the process. That's when I noticed Chris wasn't next to me anymore. I spun around, scanning the faces around me, but it was useless. Everyone was crammed so tightly together, it was impossible to tell where anyone was. I tried calling out his name, but my voice barely carried over the roar of the crowd. The knot in my stomach tightened as people started pushing harder, shoving toward the staircase to get back down. It wasn't a steady stream. It was frantic. People were moving too fast, bumping into others without a second thought. Someone shoved past me so hard I stumbled, nearly falling into a group of people who were pressed against the railing. My heart was pounding now. This didn't feel like a party anymore. It felt like something was about to go very wrong. I elbowed my way toward the staircase, desperate to get out of the crush of people. That's when I realized the staircase had become a bottleneck. The narrow passage was jammed with people, all trying to move at once. I could see a security guard at the bottom, waving his arms and yelling, but his voice was lost in the chaos. The shoving was getting worse. A girl next to me lost her balance and fell against a guy, spilling her drink all over him. He yelled at her, and she yelled back, but neither of them could move. More people were pushing from behind, trying to force their way toward the stairs. And then, like a chain reaction, someone slipped. I didn't see who, but I felt it. The sudden shift in the crowd as people tried to avoid falling themselves. It was like watching dominoes tip over in slow motion. The girl next to me went down first, then the guy she'd been arguing with. The people behind them didn't stop. They couldn't. The crowd just kept pressing forward. I tried to back up, but there was nowhere to go. The force of the crowd pushed me forward, closer to the stairs. I was trying to stay on my feet, but my legs felt like they were being swept out from under me. I could hear screaming now, real, terrified screaming. Someone grabbed my arm, pulling me upright just as I started to fall, but they lost their grip in the crush. When I finally made it to the staircase, it was pure chaos. People were piling up, some trying to climb over others to get down. I could see Chris now, near the bottom, but he wasn't moving. He was caught in the crush, his arms pinned at his sides, his face pale. I shouted his name, trying to push toward him, but the crowd kept pressing me back. I don't know how long it lasted. Minutes? Seconds? It felt like hours. The noise was deafening. Screams, shouts, the sound of people sobbing. The smell of spilled drinks and sweat was replaced by something sharper, more metallic. I remember thinking, this can't be happening. This isn't real. Eventually, I saw flashing lights through the windows, blue and red. Emergency responders were pushing their way through the crowd, shouting for people to move aside. It was like a dam breaking. The crowd started to shift, people peeling off toward the sides, collapsing against the walls or onto the floor. When I finally made it to the bottom of the stairs, I found Chris. He was slumped against the wall, his face streaked with sweat, his shirt torn. He was breathing, but barely. A paramedic was trying to talk to him, but he looked dazed, like he wasn't fully there. I helped them get him onto a stretcher, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep a grip. Around us, the scene was grim. People were lying on the floor, some unconscious, others crying or clutching their injuries. I saw a pair of shoes abandoned near the staircase, one covered in blood. Later, we found out that several people had been seriously injured in the stampede. One didn't make it. A young woman who had been trapped near the top of the stairs. Chris ended up with a cracked rib and a concussion. I escaped with a few bruises, but the real scars were mental. I haven't been to a big event since. Crowds make my chest tighten, my palms sweat. Every New Year's Eve, I think about that night and how close we came to something even worse. It's supposed to be a time for celebration, but all I can remember is the sound of screaming and the crush of bodies and the terrifying realization that something as simple as a night out can turn into a nightmare. We decided to kick off the New Year's weekend by heading to an outdoor ice rink before going to a friend's house later. The rink was packed but had that perfect winter vibe, crisp air, string lights overhead, and cheerful music playing in the background. Everyone was bundled up in scarves and hats, gliding across the ice with varying levels of grace. It felt festive, carefree, and exactly the kind of start we needed to the holidays. One of my best friends, Igor, had moved to the US not too long ago, and this was his first time experiencing the whole holiday ice skating thing. He was excited, maybe a little too excited. The guy had energy for days and couldn't wait to try something new. He borrowed skates at the rental booth, laced them up tight, and stepped onto the ice with all the confidence in the world, despite clearly being a beginner. To be fair, I wasn't a skating pro either. I could do the basics, move forward, stop without falling, but I wasn't doing tricks or anything. Igor, though? He was hyped up, talking about how he'd been watching skating videos online, and was totally ready to try out a spin he saw. I laughed it off at first, thinking he was joking. But after a while, I realized he was dead serious. The rink was busy, but manageable. Families with kids clung to the railings, teens darted through the crowd trying to show off, and couples held hands as they wobbled across the ice. Igor was somewhere in between, determined, focused, but definitely unsteady. Every time he stumbled, he just laughed and waved me off, saying he had it under control. About 30 minutes in, he skated over to me and announced, "All right, I'm gonna do it. Watch this." I wasn't sure what it was, but I had a bad feeling. I told him maybe he should stick to just skating for now, get the basics down. He shrugged me off and said, "What's the point if you're not trying something cool?" That was Igor, always pushing things a little further than necessary. Normally it was funny, but this time, I couldn't shake a weird feeling in the back of my mind. Something just felt off. I kept my distance, watching as Igor skated toward the center of the rink. The crowd thinned out in the middle, probably because people knew it was where the more confident skaters went to show off. Igor stumbled a bit as he picked up speed, his arms flailing for balance, but he kept going. My gut told me to call him back, but before I could, he shouted, "Watch this!" He tried to spin. It was clear from the start that something was going to go wrong. His knees wobbled, and instead of a smooth turn, his skates scraped awkwardly against the ice. For a second, it looked like he might recover. Then his leg gave out. He fell sideways, hitting the ice hard. The sound that followed made my stomach drop. It wasn't the dull thud of him hitting the ground. It was a sharp, sickening crack. At first, I thought it was just the ice. Maybe he hit a rough patch or something. But then I saw him grab his arm and scream. A raw, guttural sound that silenced everyone around us. I rushed over, slipping a little on the ice in my panic. By the time I got to him, he was cradling his arm, his face pale and contorted with pain. His hand was bent at an angle that wasn't natural. "I think it's broken," he gasped, but that wasn't the worst of it. As I crouched down beside him, trying to help, I noticed a dark red stain spreading on the ice. My heart stopped. "Your wrist," I said, my voice shaking. He looked down and froze. One of the skates, a sharp blade belonging to someone who'd passed too close during the fall, had sliced into his arm. The cut was deep, and blood was pouring out faster than I could process. "Help!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Somebody get help!" A few people gathered around us, but most just stared in shock. One guy handed me a scarf, and I pressed it against Igor's wrist as hard as I could. He groaned in pain, his body trembling, but the bleeding wouldn't stop. "Stay with me," I kept saying, more to myself than to him. Someone must have called for help because I heard sirens in the distance, but time felt warped. Every second stretched into an eternity. The blood kept seeping through the scarf, staining my gloves and the ice beneath us. The paramedics arrived and took over. They moved fast, wrapping his arm tightly and loading him onto a stretcher. I followed them to the ambulance, sitting in the back with Igor as they worked to stabilize him. He was conscious but barely hanging on, his face ghostly white. At the hospital, the doctors confirmed the damage was serious. The fracture in his arm would require surgery, but the cut on his wrist was the bigger issue. The skate blade had nicked an artery, and he'd lost a lot of blood. They warned us about the risk of permanent nerve damage. Hours passed before we got any real updates. When the surgeon finally came out, they told us Igor had made it through surgery, but his recovery would be long and uncertain. He might never regain full use of his hand. The weight of it all hit me hard. This was supposed to be a fun, carefree day, just some holiday skating before meeting friends, but one impulsive decision had turned it into a nightmare. Igor's medical bills were another layer of stress. His insurance wasn't great, and the costs of surgery, physical therapy, and ongoing care would add up fast. He tried to laugh it off later, joking about his expensive stunt, but I could tell it was weighing on him. Looking back, I can't stop replaying that moment when he skated out to the center. I should have stopped him. I should have said something louder, more forceful, but I didn't, and now he's paying the price. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Sometimes showing off isn't worth it. A few seconds of excitement can cost you more than you ever imagined. It started as a pretty normal New Year's Eve. I'd invited a small group of friends over to my apartment to celebrate. Nothing wild, just drinks, snacks, and music. One of my friends, Josh, brought along a guy named Mike. I didn't really know him, but Josh said he was cool. Mike seemed fine at first. Friendly, maybe a little loud, but it's a party, right? No big deal. The night was going well. We were laughing, making toasts, and watching the ball drop countdown on TV. Mike fit in just fine, though he was knocking back drinks faster than anyone else. I noticed him getting a little rowdier as the night went on, but again, it didn't seem like a problem. He kept cracking jokes, though they started getting louder and more obnoxious. At one point, he spilled his drink on the couch and laughed it off like it was no big deal. I wasn't thrilled, but I figured it wasn't worth making a scene. Around 11:30, I caught myself watching Mike more closely. Something about the way he moved seemed off. Not just drunk, but like he was buzzing with some weird kind of energy. I saw him step into the kitchen at one point and come back looking different. He wasn't holding anything, but his posture had shifted, and he had this smirk that didn't sit right. I tried to brush it off. People were starting to gather around for the midnight countdown, and I didn't want to spend the night babysitting someone I didn't even know. Josh seemed to have his eye on Mike too, so I figured if anything went sideways, Josh could handle it. Right before the countdown started, Mike raised his glass and shouted something about how it was going to be a night to remember. It sounded like a joke, but the way he said it made my stomach twist. Still, I laughed along with everyone else. We all shouted Happy New Year and clinked our glasses. For a moment, everything felt normal again. People started cheering, kissing, and hugging. Someone put on a playlist, and the vibe was good. I thought whatever weird feeling I'd had about Mike was just me overthinking. Then, out of nowhere, Mike says, "Hey, you guys want to see something cool?" Everyone turned to look at Mike. His tone was loud and eager, and he was grinning like he had the best surprise in the world. "Check this out," he said, reaching into the pocket of his jacket. I thought it was going to be a joke, maybe some firecrackers or a party trick. But then, he pulled out a gun. The room went dead silent. For a second, I thought it was fake, like a prop or something. But the weight of the moment, how everyone froze, the way Mike held it, made it clear it wasn't. My heart started pounding. "Relax," Mike said, waving it casually. "It's not loaded. I just thought you guys would appreciate some real steel." He grinned again, like he was showing off a toy. Someone nervously laughed, probably hoping to break the tension. Josh tried to step in, raising his hands in a calming gesture. "Hey Mike, maybe not the time, man," he said. But Mike didn't take the hint. "What? You scared? Look, it's perfectly safe." He aimed it at the ceiling and made a fake shooting noise. Pew pew! At that point, people started shifting uncomfortably. A couple of my friends edged toward the door. I stood frozen, trying to figure out what to do without making things worse. "Seriously, man," Josh said, his voice a little firmer now. "Put it away, it's not cool." But Mike ignored him. "You all are so uptight. It's just a little fun," he said. He spun the gun in his hand, and that's when my stomach dropped. His hand slipped, and the gun pointed briefly at someone sitting on the couch. "Whoa, careful!" they shouted, standing up quickly. I finally found my voice. "Mike, put it down," I said, louder than I meant to. Everyone turned to look at me. "You're drunk, and this isn't funny. Put the gun away now, or you need to leave." For a moment, I thought I got through to him. His grin faded, and he looked at me like he was considering it. But then he shrugged. "Fine," he muttered, and lowered the gun. Relief started washing over me, but it didn't last long. As he fumbled with the gun, maybe trying to put it back in his pocket, his finger slipped. Bang! The shot rang out, deafening in the small apartment. Everyone screamed and I instinctively ducked. My ears were ringing and my chest felt tight. It took me a second to process what had just happened. The bullet had gone through the wall. On the other side were two of my friends, who had been talking by the kitchen counter. By some miracle they weren't hit, but it had missed one of them by inches. Chaos broke out. People were yelling, crying, scrambling for the door. Mike just stood there, wide-eyed, staring at the gun like he couldn't believe what had just happened. Josh grabbed him, wrestled the gun out of his hand, and shoved him toward the door. "Get out! Get out now!" he shouted. Mike stumbled out, muttering apologies, but no one cared. Someone had already called the police, and people were flooding the stairwell, desperate to get away from the apartment. I stood in the middle of the room, shaking, trying to catch my breath and understand what the hell had just happened. The cops showed up within minutes. They took statements from everyone and secured the gun, which turned out to be loaded with more rounds. I learned later that Mike wasn't just some random guy. He had a record: assault charges, illegal possession of firearms. The gun was unregistered, and he was already wanted for something else. What scared me the most was realizing how close we all came to disaster. The bullet had hit the wall right next to a gas pipe. If it had struck the pipe, it could have caused an explosion. My landlord was furious about the damage, and I had to explain everything. The party ended with me apologizing to everyone as they left, shaken and upset. The night that was supposed to be a fun New Year's celebration turned into something none of us would forget for all the wrong reasons. I don't host parties anymore. I love decorating the house for Christmas and New Year. There's something about the lights, the ornaments, and the cozy atmosphere that just makes everything feel magical. This year, I decided to step up my game and bought a brand new string of multicolored lights. They weren't cheap, but they looked amazing when I tested them in the store. Each bulb was small but incredibly bright, and the colors shifted in this smooth, mesmerizing pattern. Perfect for the staircase, I thought. After I got home, I spent a good hour winding the string around the wooden banister of our staircase. The wood was dark and polished, and the lights gave it this glowing, almost fairy tale-like quality. I turned off the overhead lights in the living room to admire my work. The way the colors reflected off the walls, it really did feel magical. The kids loved it too. My youngest kept saying it looked like something out of a movie, and my wife smiled and said it was my best decoration yet. I even snapped a couple of pictures to send to my family group chat. Everyone commented on how festive it looked. By evening, the house was filled with the smell of freshly baked cookies and the sound of Christmas music. Family and a few close friends started arriving for our little holiday gathering. It was casual, nothing too fancy, just food, drinks, and good company. People were complimenting the decorations, and I found myself standing near the staircase more than once, admiring those lights again. But as the night went on, I started to notice something odd. The lights weren't staying on as smoothly as they had before. At first I thought I was imagining it, but then I saw it clearly. The lights would flicker every now and then. It wasn't a gentle, twinkling kind of flicker. It was more abrupt, like they were cutting out for a fraction of a second before coming back on. "Looks like those lights are giving you trouble already," my brother-in-law joked when he caught me staring at them. "Probably just a loose connection," I said, trying to brush it off. "I'll check it out later," but I didn't get the chance to. Between keeping drinks filled, checking on the kids, and trying to actually enjoy the evening, the lights slipped from my mind. It wasn't until much later, when we were all seated around the dining table, that I noticed the flickering had gotten worse. It wasn't just the flickering either. Now, every so often, one section of the string would dim almost completely before snapping back to full brightness. I thought about getting up to adjust the plug or maybe reseat the bulbs, but I didn't want to interrupt the dinner. "Do you smell something?" my wife asked suddenly, cutting through the chatter at the table. I froze. My first thought was that she'd caught a whiff of burnt food. Maybe something had spilled in the oven. But then I smelled it too. It wasn't food. It was sharper, heavier. Something like burning plastic. And that was when I heard it. A faint but unmistakable popping sound from the direction of the staircase. Before I could even push my chair back, there was a loud crackle, followed by a bright, sudden flash near the stairs. Everyone at the table turned to look. That's when we saw the first lick of flame, small but fierce, curling up from the lights wrapped around the wooden banister. "Fire!" someone yelled, and the room erupted into chaos. I bolted toward the stairs, heart pounding, but the fire was spreading faster than I could process. The plastic casing of the string lights was melting, dripping onto the carpet below, and the wooden banister was already catching. I grabbed the nearest throw blanket from the couch and started slapping at the flames, but the heat was intense, and the fire only seemed to grow angrier. "Call 911!" my wife screamed, ushering the kids toward the front door. My brother-in-law yanked a fire extinguisher off the wall in the kitchen, thank God we had one, and rushed to my side. He sprayed foam over the staircase, but it didn't seem to be enough. The flames were moving fast, eating through the carpet and licking up the walls. The smell was overwhelming, a nauseating mix of burning plastic, wood, and chemicals. My lungs burned as I coughed, trying to stay low to avoid the thickening smoke. "Get out! Now!" my brother-in-law shouted, his voice panicked but firm. He grabbed my arm and pulled me back as the fire roared higher, nearly reaching the ceiling. The staircase was a lost cause. I stumbled toward the door, my head spinning, my hands shaking. Outside, my wife had already gotten the kids into the car, where they sat crying, their faces pressed against the windows. Neighbors were starting to gather on the lawn, their expressions a mix of concern and fear. The fire department arrived within minutes, but by then, the fire had engulfed most of the staircase and part of the living room. Flames were bursting through the windows, sending shards of glass raining onto the snow-covered lawn. The firefighters worked quickly, their hoses blasting streams of water into the house, but the damage was severe. I stood there, helpless, clutching my wife as the kids sobbed in the background. The house, our home, was being torn apart in front of us, and all because of a stupid set of lights. When the fire was finally out and the smoke began to clear, one of the firefighters approached us. His face was serious, his voice calm but firm. "It looks like the fire started from those lights on your staircase," he said, gesturing to the charred remains of the banister. "There was probably a short circuit. Were they new?" I nodded numbly, barely able to process his words. "Cheap wiring, maybe," he continued. "We've seen it before with some of these imported lights. They're not always made to code. Cheap wiring." I had spent hours picking those lights out, marveling at how beautiful they looked. And now they had destroyed our home. In the days that followed, as we dealt with insurance adjusters and tried to figure out what could be salvaged, I couldn't stop replaying the night in my head. The smell, the heat, the chaos, it all stuck with me, a haunting reminder of how quickly things could go wrong. We were lucky in a way. Everyone made it out safely. But the house, the place where we'd celebrated so many holidays, raised our kids and made countless memories, was almost unrecognizable. The staircase was gone, the living room gutted, and the upstairs had severe smoke damage. It would take months to rebuild. I learned a hard lesson that night. Never trust decorations that seem too good to be true. Since then, I've been obsessive about checking safety ratings and buying from reputable stores, even if it costs a little more. Christmas still feels magical, but it's different now. There's a lingering caution, a voice in the back of my head reminding me to double-check everything. Because once you've seen how fast a fire can destroy everything, you never forget. Last year, we decided to ring in the new year at my friend Mark's apartment in Chicago. It was one of those classic holiday gatherings, champagne flowing, music playing, everyone cracking jokes and sharing embarrassing stories. The apartment was warm and crowded, the air thick with the smell of snacks and a faint hint of vanilla from a candle someone had lit. We were all in high spirits, especially Michelle, one of our close friends. She'd arrived with her usual energy, joking about how she'd almost slipped on the icy sidewalk outside. It was around 10 that night when she started to seem off. At first, it was subtle. She winced slightly as she sat down on the couch, holding her stomach. I noticed, but didn't think much of it. Maybe she'd eaten something that didn't agree with her. A little while later, though, Michelle quietly pulled me aside. "Hey," she said, her voice low but strained. "I'm not feeling great. My stomach really hurts. Like, bad." She was trying to downplay it, but her pale face gave her away. "Do you need anything? Water? Aspirin?" I asked, already glancing toward the kitchen. "I don't know. Maybe I just need to sit for a bit," she replied, but I could see her clutching her side tightly as she shuffled back to the couch. Mark noticed too, and asked her if she wanted to lie down in his room. She shook her head, said she'd be fine. But as the minutes ticked by, it was obvious that she wasn't. Her usual lively demeanor was gone. She was slouched over, her arms wrapped around her middle like she was trying to hold herself together. By midnight, while everyone else was counting down and popping confetti cannons, Michelle was sitting silently in a corner, her face white as a sheet. That's when the gravity of the situation hit. This wasn't just a stomach ache. Something was really wrong. After the clock struck midnight, the mood in the apartment shifted. The excitement of the countdown quickly gave way to concern as more people noticed Michelle's condition. By then, she was barely speaking, just shaking her head and doubling over with each wave of pain. "Michelle, we need to do something," I said firmly. She nodded weakly, and someone suggested calling an ambulance. Mark grabbed his phone, and within seconds, he was on the line with 911. The dispatcher sounded calm, too calm for the urgency we felt. Mark relayed Michelle's symptoms, emphasizing how bad it had gotten, but the dispatcher's response wasn't what we wanted to hear. "It's New Year's Eve," they explained. "High call volume. It may take over an hour for an ambulance to get there." "What?" "Are you serious?" Mark shouted into the phone, but there was nothing more the dispatcher could do. We hung up, stunned. An hour? She didn't look like she had an hour. "We need to drive her to the hospital," I said. But that wasn't going to work either. Everyone in the room had been drinking, and none of us felt confident or sober enough to drive through icy streets in the middle of the night. One guy, Jake, started looking for rideshare apps, but surge pricing was through the roof, and no drivers seemed to be nearby. Michelle groaned loudly, clutching her stomach tighter. I can't wait," she said through gritted teeth. Panic was setting in. We didn't know what to do. Some people started blaming themselves for not noticing earlier. Others were frantically texting anyone who might be able to help. The minutes dragged on, and Michelle's condition only worsened. She started slipping in and out of consciousness, her head lolling back against the couch. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we heard the wail of sirens outside. 2 paramedics rushed into the apartment, their faces serious as they assessed Michelle. One of them asked her a few questions, but she was barely coherent. They loaded her onto a stretcher and whisked her away. We followed in separate cars, using ride shares that finally became available. When we got to the hospital, the mood in the waiting room was tense and quiet. No one knew what to say. After about an hour, a doctor came out to speak with us. His expression was grim. It was acute appendicitis, he explained. But there were complications. The appendix had ruptured, and there was severe infection. We did everything we could, but we couldn't save her. The words hit like a brick wall. No one moved. No one spoke. It was impossible to process. Michelle had been laughing and joking with us just hours ago, and now she was gone. In the days that followed, we learned more about what had happened. Michelle had a condition she didn't know about, something that made her appendix more prone to rupturing. If we'd gotten her to the hospital sooner, they might have been able to save her. It's a thought that still haunts me. Looking back, I wish we'd acted faster, found another way to get her help, anything but sitting there hoping the ambulance would come in time. Now, every New Year's Eve feels heavy. We try to celebrate, but there's always a moment when the memories of that night flood back. And it's a reminder, if someone's in trouble, don't wait. Don't assume help will come in time. Sometimes, you have to take matters into your own hands, no matter how inconvenient or difficult it might seem. It's better than living with the regret of doing too little, too late. My neighbors in the suburbs decided to have a little New Year's Eve celebration in their backyard. It was nothing fancy, just a few families, some grilled steaks, and sparklers for the kids. They'd set up one of those tall propane heaters to keep everyone warm since the yard was blanketed in snow. It felt cozy, especially with the string lights they'd hung around the patio. I wasn't planning to stay long. I'd only dropped by to wish them a happy new year. But they waved me over, insisting I join in for a drink. I figured, why not? We'd always gotten along well, and it wasn't like I had anywhere else to be. They handed me a beer, and I settled into one of the folding chairs near the grill. Their little girl, Lizzie, was running around the yard with a sparkler in each hand, giggling and twirling. She couldn't have been older than 7, with big bouncing curls and a laugh that could light up the whole night. Her dad, Mike, was flipping steaks on the grill, and her mom, Anna, was pouring cider for the adults. It was a picture-perfect suburban scene. That's when I noticed it. The heater, they'd placed it next to the patio table, was making this low, sputtering sound, like it was struggling to stay on. Every so often, the flame inside would flare slightly, almost like it was catching too much gas. I mentioned it to Mike as casually as I could. "Hey, is that thing supposed to sound like that?" I asked, nodding toward it. He glanced at it, shrugged, and waved me off. "Yeah, it's fine. These things do that sometimes. I've used it a ton. It's no big deal." I didn't press it. I mean, I wasn't exactly an expert on propane heaters, and Mike seemed confident. Still, something about the way the heater hissed and flared stuck with me. I found myself glancing over at it more than once while we chatted. Lizzie came darting past us, her sparklers throwing off little showers of sparks. "Look, Uncle Sam!" she yelled, holding one up proudly for me to see. I gave her a smile and a thumbs up, but my eyes kept drifting back to that heater. The night wore on, and the kids started getting rowdier. Someone brought out a box of small fireworks, the kind that pop and fizzle on the ground. Lizzie was thrilled, bouncing on her toes as her dad lit a couple for her. The smell of sulfur mixed with the cold, crisp air. But that damn heater, it just kept making that noise. Suddenly there was a sharp pop. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make everyone pause. My eyes snapped to the heater just in time to see a faint orange flicker at its base. Mike noticed too and muttered, "What the hell?" as he moved closer to check it out. The flame inside had grown stronger, licking at the metal sides in uneven bursts. I stood up, and so did Anna. Both of us watching as Mike crouched down near the heater, his head tilted like he was trying to figure out what was wrong. Lizzie, still holding a sparkler, wandered a little too close, and Anna quickly called her back. "It's fine," Mike said again, but this time he sounded less sure. He reached for the knob to turn it off. Before he could, there was another pop, louder this time, and the bottom of the heater erupted in flames. The fire spread fast, licking up the propane tank and sending a wave of heat rolling across the yard. Someone screamed. Mike stumbled backward, yelling for Anna to grab the kids. Panic set in. People scrambled in every direction, shouting over each other as the flames climbed higher. I grabbed a handful of snow and tried throwing it at the base of the heater, but it did nothing. The flames were too intense, and the heat was unbearable. Then I heard it, a high-pitched scream that cut through the chaos. Lizzie. I turned just in time to see her trip and fall near the edge of the patio. The sparkler she'd been holding landed next to her, and her jacket, one of those cheap, puffy ones that look like they're made of plastic, caught fire. The flames spread instantly, devouring the synthetic material. Anna was screaming, and Mike bolted toward Lizzie, but I was closer. I ran to her as fast as I could, pulling off my own jacket as I dropped to the ground. She was thrashing, crying, her little hands beating against the flames as they climbed up her sleeve. "Lizzie, stop moving!" I shouted, though I knew she couldn't hear me. I threw my jacket over her and pressed down hard, trying to smother the flames. The smell of burning fabric and skin was nauseating, but I didn't stop. Mike was there a second later, throwing snow over her, his hands trembling so badly that most of it missed. By the time we got the flames out, Lizzie wasn't moving. Her jacket was charred black, and her arm, God, her arm, was blistered and raw. Anna dropped to her knees beside her, sobbing and screaming for someone to call 911. The rest of the night was a blur. The fire on the heater died down after the propane tank emptied, leaving behind a scorched, blackened shell. The paramedics arrived quickly, loading Lizzie into the ambulance while Anna rode with her. Mike stayed behind, pacing the yard and muttering to himself, his face pale and streaked with soot. I couldn't stop staring at the heater. Its metal frame was warped and twisted, the heat having melted part of it like wax. The smell of burned plastic and propane lingered in the air, mixing with the cold bite of the snow. Lizzie survived, but the burns on her arm and side were severe. She spent weeks in the hospital and months in rehab. They said she'd recover, but she'd always have the scars. Every time I think about that night, I ask myself why I didn't push harder when I noticed the heater acting up. Why I didn't insist that Mike turn it off or move it away from the patio. It wasn't my fault, at least that's what people keep telling me, but it doesn't feel that way. We all just wanted to celebrate the new year, to enjoy a simple, happy evening. But instead, Lizzie's screams still echo in my head, and the image of her small, burned body haunts my dreams. If you're reading this, take it from me. Check your equipment. Don't brush off warning signs. Because sometimes the smallest things can turn into the worst kind of nightmare. After the divorce, I started living alone. It wasn't easy at first, but by the time New Year's Eve rolled around, I was finally starting to feel settled in my new life. I decided to keep the holiday low-key, just a small gathering at my place with 2 close friends and a couple of their partners. Nothing fancy, just some laughter, snacks, and watching the countdown on TV. The evening started perfectly. We shared stories, played a few board games, and drank some wine. I had even put up a small tree and some lights, trying to make the place feel festive. It was nice, and for the first time in a while, I felt genuinely happy. We all laughed as we watched one of those cheesy holiday specials, and everything just felt normal. Around 10:30, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Happy New Year. Hope it's a good one." I didn't think much of it. Probably one of those automatic messages or a wrong number. I shrugged it off and put the phone back on the counter, too absorbed in the fun of the night to care. A little after 11, I got up to grab another bottle of wine from the kitchen. On my way, I glanced at the front door out of habit. The deadbolt was turned, just like it had been all night. But for some reason, my stomach tightened. Something didn't feel right. I shook it off. Just the wine messing with me, probably. Then there was a knock. It wasn't loud or aggressive, but it wasn't exactly casual either. Everyone froze for a moment. I made a joke about it being carolers, even though it was way too late for that. One of my friends suggested it might be a neighbor. Maybe someone needing help. I hesitated but decided to check. When I opened the door, my heart sank. It was him, my ex-husband. He was smiling, but it wasn't the friendly kind. It was that smile he used to give when he was already on his second or third drink and spoiling for a fight. His eyes were glassy, and his breath reeked of alcohol. I immediately regretted opening the door. "Hey," he slurred, leaning on the doorframe like he owned the place. "Just thought I'd drop by. Wish you a Happy New Year." I tried to keep my voice steady. "It's late, and I have people over. This isn't a good time." He laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "People over? Didn't think you'd move on so fast." His eyes darted past me into the apartment, scanning the room like he was taking inventory. My friends had gone quiet in the background, but I could feel their eyes on me. "Please leave," I said, trying to stay calm. "This isn't appropriate." His face darkened. For a moment, he just stared at me, the smile gone. Then he stepped forward, forcing me to move back. "I'm just here to talk," he said, his voice dropping into something more menacing. "That's not a crime, is it?" I could feel my pulse racing. My ex wasn't the kind of guy who took rejection well. In the years we were married, I had learned that the hard way. My friend Ben, sitting closest to the door, stood up. "Hey man," he said, keeping his tone light but firm. "Maybe it's time to head out. Let's not ruin the night, yeah?" My ex turned to him slowly, and I saw the flicker of anger in his expression. Something bad was about to happen, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, standing there like an idiot. My hands clenched into fists, but I didn't know what to do. And then my ex took one more step inside. Ben stepped closer, positioning himself between me and my ex. "Look, man," he said evenly. "You've had a few drinks. Let's just call it a night, okay?" That's when it happened. My ex's hand shot into his jacket pocket, and I saw the glint of a blade. It was small, but the way he held it made my blood run cold. My breath caught, and I couldn't speak. The room went dead silent. My ex waved the knife in a lazy, almost mocking motion, his eyes fixed on Ben. "You think you can tell me what to do?" he sneered. "This isn't your place." My friend Lisa, sitting on the couch, reached for her phone as discreetly as she could. I saw her fingers trembling as she unlocked it and dialed. My ex didn't seem to notice. His focus was locked on Ben, who hadn't moved an inch. "Put it down," Ben said, his voice calm but firm. "No one wants this to get ugly." My ex laughed again, louder this time, and the sound made my stomach twist. "Ugly? You don't even know the half of it, buddy." His voice cracked with anger, and before anyone could react, he lunged. Ben dodged just in time, but the knife grazed his arm. He stumbled back, clutching at the wound, blood already seeping through his fingers. Lisa screamed, and that seemed to snap me out of my paralysis. "Stop!" I yelled, my voice shaking. "What the hell is wrong with you?" My ex turned to me, his face contorted with rage. "This is your fault," he spat. "You always make everything so damn hard." That was the moment I realized he wasn't going to stop. Not until someone made him. I moved toward the door, my heart pounding, hoping to distract him long enough for the police to arrive. "Get out!" I shouted, grabbing a heavy vase from the side table. For a second, he hesitated, his gaze flickering between me and Ben, who was still clutching his arm but staying upright. Then we heard it, the faint wail of sirens in the distance. "Cops?" my ex muttered, his voice low and venomous. He turned back to me, his eyes narrowing. "You called the cops on me?" I didn't answer. There was no point. The sirens were getting closer, and for the first time that night, he seemed unsure of himself. He backed toward the door, the knife still in his hand. "You think this is over?" he said, glaring at me. "It's not over." The door burst open before he could make another move. 2 officers rushed in, their weapons drawn, shouting commands. My ex dropped the knife and raised his hands, a smug grin spreading across his face. "Relax," he said. "I was just leaving." The officers weren't buying it. They pinned him against the wall and cuffed him while one of them asked if everyone was okay. Ben nodded, though his face was pale, and Lisa was still shaking. I could barely speak, but I managed to whisper, "He cut him. My friend needs help." The paramedics arrived shortly after and took Ben to the hospital. Thankfully, the wound wasn't too deep. He needed stitches, but he'd be okay. My ex was taken into custody, but even as they let him out, he kept looking back at me with that same twisted smile. The night ended with all of us at the police station, giving statements. It was surreal, sitting under those harsh fluorescent lights, trying to piece together what had just happened. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window and sat on the couch until the sun came up. That night changed everything for me. I stopped telling people my plans unless I trusted them completely. I installed a better security system and started carrying pepper spray. But the worst part? I still hear his voice sometimes, especially late at night, whispering in my head, "It's not over." I decided to host a small New Year's Eve party at my place, mostly for close friends and a few coworkers. Nothing big or fancy, just a casual get-together with some snacks, drinks, and music. A couple of friends brought +1s, which was fine by me. I wasn't strict about the guest list. The vibe started off great. Everyone was in good spirits, sipping champagne, chatting, and laughing. It felt like the kind of night that was going to end with us all counting down together and maybe playing some stupid games. Around 10 or so, I noticed Ethan, one of my coworkers, was hitting the drinks harder than anyone else. He wasn't sloppy yet, but you could tell he was on his way. At first, I brushed it off. It's New Year's, right? People tend to overdo it a little. But Ethan wasn't just drinking. He was also starting to dominate conversations, cutting people off mid-sentence and getting louder with each drink. I don't think anyone was really bothered at first, but there was this moment when he started going off about how we were celebrating wrong. He had this whole rant about how everyone needed to drink more, be louder, have more fun. It was weird, like he was trying to control how everyone else was enjoying the night. A few people laughed nervously, but you could see some uncomfortable glances being exchanged. I tried to steer things back on track, asking people to join me in a toast and turning up the music a bit. That seemed to diffuse the awkwardness temporarily. But then Ethan started targeting one of the quieter guests, this guy named Dylan who came with a mutual friend. Dylan was sipping on a beer, minding his own business, and Ethan kept yelling at him to catch up or stop being a buzzkill. Dylan tried to laugh it off at first, but Ethan wouldn't let up. He kept pressing, leaning into Dylan's space, waving his drink around. I stepped in and told Ethan to chill, offering him a glass of water and suggesting he sit down for a bit. He grinned at me, this sloppy, almost mocking smile, and said he was just having fun. For a moment, I thought it worked. Ethan backed off and sat on the couch, scrolling on his phone. But something about his energy felt off, like he was holding on to whatever irritation he had. The whole time, I was trying to juggle being a host and keeping an eye on him without making it obvious. It was exhausting. Then, right before midnight, it all escalated. We were about 10 minutes away from the countdown when Ethan suddenly got up from the couch. He stumbled toward Dylan, slurring something about him being the weakest link at the party. I was mid-conversation with another guest when I heard Ethan's voice rise again. By the time I turned around, he was standing over Dylan, pointing a finger in his face and laughing in this harsh, jeering way. Dylan looked frozen, unsure whether to respond or just leave. I stepped in between them and told Ethan to knock it off. He waved me off, muttering something about people like Dylan ruining good times. I had had enough. I told Ethan he needed to leave. That was the spark. Ethan's face twisted, and his voice went from obnoxiously loud to downright hostile. He started yelling at everyone in the room, calling us names, saying we were all lame and couldn't handle real fun. I could feel the tension shift. What had been an easygoing party now felt heavy, uncomfortable. And then, out of nowhere, Ethan shoved Dylan. Hard. Dylan wasn't ready for it, and he staggered back, hitting the corner of my dining table. The sound of his head hitting the wood was sickening. Dylan crumpled to the ground, blood immediately pooling around him. Everything stopped. The music, the chatter, the laughter. It all went dead silent except for someone gasping, "Oh my God." I rushed to Dylan, kneeling beside him as someone yelled for me to call 911. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial. Dylan's eyes were closed, and he wasn't responding. His breathing was shallow. The blood. There was so much of it. I grabbed a towel from the kitchen and pressed it to the back of his head, trying to keep pressure on the wound. While I was doing that, Ethan started yelling again, this time about how it wasn't his fault and how we were blowing this out of proportion. He was pacing, agitated, still holding his drink like nothing had happened. One of my friends tried to calm him down, but Ethan shoved him too, and at that point, I told someone to get him out of the apartment. Ethan refused to leave. Instead, he started hurling insults at all of us, calling us cowards for helping Dylan. He grabbed his coat, stormed to the door, and screamed, "You'll regret this!" before slamming it behind him. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but it felt like hours. They loaded Dylan onto a stretcher, and I could see the worry on their faces. One of them told me quietly that he might have a serious brain injury. My stomach dropped. The police showed up shortly after and asked me to recount everything. I was still in shock, stumbling over my words, trying to explain how the night had gone so wrong. They took statements from the other guests and promised to look for Ethan, but by then, he was long gone. Dylan was rushed into emergency surgery that night. I got a call the next morning from a mutual friend who had gone to the hospital to check on him. He was in a coma, and the doctors weren't optimistic. The rest of that day was a blur. I couldn't stop replaying the scene in my head. Ethan shoving Dylan, the sound of his head hitting the table, the blood. I felt like it was my fault. I'd invited Ethan, let him drink too much, and hadn't forced him to leave earlier. 2 days later, we got the news that Dylan had passed away. The doctors said the injury caused a massive brain bleed. He didn't have a chance. Ethan turned himself in a week later after the police put out a warrant for his arrest. He was charged with manslaughter, and last I heard, he's serving time. But none of that brings Dylan back. I've thought about that night every day since. How something as simple as a small party, meant to bring people together, turned into the worst night of my life. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that you have to draw the line with people like Ethan. Don't make excuses for them. Don't let things slide, because one bad decision can ruin everything. My best friend, Anna, was staying with me for a few weeks while her apartment was being renovated. It was a bit cramped, but we made it work. With New Year's Eve coming up, we decided to host a small get-together at my place. Just a few close friends and her new boyfriend, Alex. She seemed excited about introducing him to everyone, and I figured it'd be a fun way to ring in the new year. The night started off like any other casual gathering. We ordered pizza, poured some wine, and played music while chatting in the living room. Alex arrived a bit late, carrying a bottle of champagne and a gift bag for Anna. He seemed polite but quiet, mostly keeping to himself while the rest of us laughed and swapped stories. He wasn't rude or anything, just a little reserved, typical for someone meeting a group of new people. As the evening went on, I noticed Alex was unusually focused on Anna. It wasn't the sweet, attentive kind of focus you'd expect from a boyfriend. It was sharper, like he was analyzing her every move. At one point, when she was talking to one of my friends, Matt, Alex's eyes narrowed in a way that made me uncomfortable. It was subtle, but enough to catch my attention. Later, while we were eating, Alex brought up a topic that shifted the mood. He started talking about how honesty was the foundation of any relationship. At first, it sounded like he was just making casual conversation, but then he turned to Anna and asked her directly about her exes. The room went quiet. Anna looked startled and stammered something about not wanting to discuss that in front of everyone. I tried to change the subject, joking about how we all had cringy ex stories, but Alex wasn't letting it go. "Don't you think it's important to know everything about someone's past?" he asked, his tone a little too firm. Anna shrugged, clearly trying to brush it off, but the tension was obvious. I shot her a quick look, silently asking if she was okay, but she just gave me a small, tight-lipped smile. As the night wore on, Alex's behavior became more noticeable. Whenever Anna laughed at something Matt said, Alex would shift uncomfortably in his seat or clench his jaw. At one point, I caught him glaring at Matt from across the room, and it wasn't just a passing glance. It was the kind of look that made my stomach knot. I debated whether to say something to Anna, but I didn't want to make a scene. When it got closer to midnight, we all gathered around the TV for the countdown. Alex stood close to Anna, one arm around her shoulders. She looked stiff, like she was trying to enjoy herself, but couldn't fully relax. I kept an eye on them, feeling like something was brewing beneath the surface. After the countdown and a round of cheers and toasts, Alex handed Anna the gift bag he'd brought. "Open it," he said, his voice low but insistent. Anna hesitated, looking around the room like she wanted privacy, but Alex didn't budge. She finally pulled out the tissue paper and revealed a small velvet box. Inside was a bracelet, simple but elegant. At first, Anna smiled and thanked him, but then Alex said, "I hope this reminds you of what it means to stay loyal." His words were calm, but there was a weight to them that silenced the room. Anna's smile faded, and she glanced at me, her eyes wide with unease. That's when I knew for sure. Something was very, very wrong. The room felt heavy after Alex's comment. No one said anything for a moment, and the tension was thick enough to cut through. I cleared my throat and made an excuse to grab more drinks from the kitchen, motioning for Anna to follow me. She hesitated but eventually put the bracelet back in the box and slipped away with me. As soon as we were out of earshot, I asked her, "Are you okay?" That felt weird. Anna gave me a nervous laugh, brushing her hair behind her ear. "He's just intense sometimes. I think he's nervous meeting everyone." She avoided my eyes as she spoke, which told me she didn't even believe her own words. "Anna, he's not acting nervous. He's acting controlling," I said bluntly. "Are you sure you're okay with this guy?" She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Alex appeared in the doorway. His face was calm, but there was something cold in his expression. "Everything okay in here?" he asked, his eyes flicking between us. "Yep, just grabbing drinks," I said, trying to sound casual. Anna nodded quickly, her smile too forced. "We're coming back out now." Back in the living room, the mood was strained. Matt and a couple of my other friends were sitting stiffly on the couch, clearly uncomfortable. Alex seemed more on edge now, his arm draped possessively around Anna as if staking a claim. He kept staring at Matt, and the tension was undeniable. Then it happened. Out of nowhere, Alex stood up and pointed at Matt. "You think I don't see what's going on here?" he snapped. "You've been flirting with her all night." Matt, caught completely off guard, held up his hands. "Whoa, what? I haven't done anything. Dude, calm down." Anna immediately jumped up, her face pale. "Alex, stop! You're overreacting. Matt's just my friend." "Friend?" Alex scoffed. "Do you think I'm stupid? You've been laughing at his jokes, touching his arm. You think I wouldn't notice?" The shouting escalated quickly. My other friends tried to intervene, telling Alex to relax, but he wasn't having it. He turned on Anna, his voice sharp and angry. You've been playing me this whole time, haven't you? I knew you couldn't be trusted. Enough! I yelled, stepping between them. You're out of line. You need to leave. But Alex wasn't listening. He shoved past me, grabbing Anna's arm. We're leaving, now. Anna yanked her arm free, tears streaming down her face. I'm not going anywhere with you. That's when things turned physical. Alex shoved Anna backward, and she tripped over a chair, hitting the edge of the dining table as she fell. The sound of her body hitting the floor was sickening. Are you out of your mind? I screamed, rushing to help Anna. She was holding her head, clearly dazed. Matt and another friend jumped in, trying to hold Alex back, but he lashed out, throwing punches wildly. The scene devolved into chaos, shouting, crashing furniture, and Alex's violent rage filling the air. I fumbled for my phone and called 911, my hands shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons. By the time the police arrived, Anna was slumped on the floor, still conscious but clearly hurt. Alex was restrained by my friends, his face red and twisted with fury. The officers quickly took control, separating everyone and arresting Alex. Anna was taken to the hospital, and we found out later she had a mild concussion and bruised ribs. But the nightmare didn't end there. When the police ran Alex's information, they discovered he had a restraining order from a previous girlfriend and a history of violent behavior. He wasn't supposed to be near her, much less dating anyone. Anna was devastated. She couldn't believe she had missed the warning signs. He was so sweet at first, she kept saying, over and over, as if trying to convince herself that the man who attacked her was someone else entirely. The thought that shook me most was how easily things could have gone even worse. If my friends and I hadn't been there, or if Alex had brought something more dangerous than his fists, I don't even want to think about what could have happened. Anna pressed charges, and Alex was held without bail pending his trial. But the fear didn't go away. For weeks, she stayed with me, too scared to go back to her apartment, even after the renovations were done. She kept her curtains drawn, jumped at loud noises, and avoided her phone in case he somehow tried to contact her. Real monsters don't hide under the bed. They sit next to you at dinner, bring you gifts, and smile at your friends. And sometimes, they're the people you think you can trust. My friends had bought this massive box of fireworks, claiming it was going to make for the best New Year's show we'd ever seen. We were all gathered in the backyard of a small house in a quiet suburban neighborhood in the US. It was the kind of area where people park their cars on the street, and you can hear crickets chirping if you stay quiet long enough. Everything about the setup seemed ordinary, just a bunch of friends excited to ring in the new year, with some flashy lights and loud booms. We thought we had it all figured out. We moved away from the parked cars, stayed clear of the house, and planned to light them in an open area. The idea was to create a little spectacle for ourselves, and maybe give the neighbors something fun to watch too. Everyone was in high spirits, laughing, talking about their resolutions, and sharing drinks as we waited for midnight to roll around. The box of fireworks sat in the middle of the yard like the centerpiece of our night, promising an unforgettable show. When we brought the box out, though, I noticed it didn't look right. The cardboard was dented in a few places, and one corner was slightly torn. It didn't look like how I imagined something that big and expensive should. I said something about it, asking if they were sure it was fine. One of my friends, the one who actually bought it, shrugged and waved me off. We already checked it, he said casually. It's all good, trust me. It didn't sit right with me. Something about the way the box looked made me uneasy, but I didn't want to be the buzzkill. Everyone else was hyped, and the last thing I wanted was to make a big deal out of nothing. So I kept quiet and stepped back with the others as my friend crouched down to light the first fuse. It was one of those long fuses, the kind that gives you plenty of time to light it and get out of the way. Except as soon as the spark caught, the fuse burned faster than I expected. My gut told me we were standing too close to the house, but by the time I opened my mouth to say something, it was too late. The hiss and crackle of the fuse had already turned into a roar as the first firework shot up into the sky. The first firework launched without a hitch, exploding in the air in a bright burst of red and gold. We all cheered, relieved that everything seemed fine. But then something unexpected happened. The second firework didn't take off like it was supposed to. Instead, it popped loudly right on the ground, sending a spray of sparks in every direction. We froze for half a second, not sure what to do. That's when the real chaos began. The sparks hit the rest of the fireworks in the box, and before anyone could react, it was like a chain reaction started. Rockets, fountains, and Roman candles all ignited at once, launching in random directions. I saw one streak straight toward a neighbor's window, shattering the glass on impact. Another zipped sideways and slammed into the side of a parked car with a loud thunk. Sparks flew as the car alarm started blaring. "Get back!" someone yelled, but it was hard to move in the confusion. Fireworks were going off all around us, whistling and booming so loud it felt like being in the middle of a war zone. People were scrambling, ducking behind fences or diving onto the ground. I tripped over a lawn chair as a fountain of sparks shot straight into the sky, raining embers everywhere. The heat from the explosions was so close I could feel it on my face. Then came the smell of smoke, sharp and acrid. I turned toward the house and saw flames licking up the side of the neighbor's wooden fence, spreading fast. The dry winter air seemed to feed the fire, and within seconds it had jumped to a pile of old leaves stacked against their back porch. Someone shouted, "Call 911," but I couldn't tell who. Everything was happening too fast to process. By the time the first fire truck arrived, the damage was already done. The fire had spread from the neighbor's fence to their house, charring the side of the structure and blowing out another window. The car that had been hit earlier was now engulfed in flames, the paint bubbling and peeling as the heat intensified. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered outside, some filming on their phones, others yelling and pointing at the mess we'd made. The firefighters worked quickly, dousing the flames before they could destroy the entire house. But the damage was severe. A whole room on the first floor was blackened and gutted, and the car was a total loss, just a burned-out shell by the time the fire was extinguished. The smell of burned wood, plastic, and chemicals hung heavy in the air. Then the police arrived. They took statements from all of us, but the mood shifted when they asked who had been responsible for the fireworks. My friend tried to play it off, saying it was just a mistake, but the officers didn't seem amused. One of them took a closer look at the remaining debris and frowned. "This box looks tampered with," he said, motioning toward the crumpled packaging. "Did you buy these from a licensed dealer?" The answer, of course, was no. My friend had picked them up from some guy selling them out of his truck in a parking lot. The officer's expression hardened when he heard that. "These are illegal fireworks," he said. "You shouldn't have even had them here, let alone set them off." The night ended with more paperwork and promises of court dates. The owners of the damaged house and car were understandably furious, threatening lawsuits. It turned out their insurance wasn't going to cover everything, and they made it clear they'd be coming after us for the costs. My friend who bought the fireworks was in the most trouble, but all of us felt the weight of what had happened. Looking back, I realize how stupid we were. We treated those fireworks like they were toys, ignoring the warning signs and brushing off the risks. It wasn't just a fun night gone wrong, it was negligence, plain and simple. And it cost people their property, their sense of safety, and almost their lives. That night, I learned how quickly things can spiral out of control. One bad decision can lead to a chain reaction, and before you know it, you're left standing in the wreckage, wishing you could take it all back. I still hear the sound of that car alarm sometimes, and it's like a reminder. You don't mess around with things you don't fully understand. The consequences can be devastating. I wasn't planning on inviting Patrick to the New Year's party. We had this long-standing tension between us, some drama from years ago that never really got resolved. But someone else from our friend group decided to include him. I guess they thought it'd be awkward not to, and maybe they were right. When I found out, I didn't want to make a big deal of it. I just told myself to keep my distance and hope for the best. At first, everything seemed fine. The living room was full of laughter, music, and people passing around plates of food and drinks. I tried to focus on catching up with friends I hadn't seen in months. Patrick was there, sitting on the far side of the room, quiet for the most part. But I could feel his presence, like this weight in the air. It didn't take long for the comments to start. Little things at first, barely loud enough for anyone else to hear. As I walked past him to grab a drink, he muttered, "Surprised you didn't ban me from coming." Later, when someone asked about my new job, I caught him smirking and saying under his breath, "Must be nice to always get what you want." I ignored him. I told myself not to take the bait, but it was getting harder. I'd see him glance in my direction, then lean over to whisper something to whoever he was sitting next to. A couple of times, they'd laugh and look at me like they were in on some joke. I could feel my chest getting tight, but I kept my focus on the party. At one point, I moved into the kitchen to take a breather. That's when I noticed Patrick following me. He didn't say anything, just stood in the doorway watching me pour myself a drink. I tried to act casual, like I didn't even notice him there, but my hands were shaking. Finally, he said, "What, not even gonna say hi? Or are you too good for that now?" I didn't look at him. "I'm just here to enjoy the night. Can we not do this?" He laughed, this low, bitter laugh. "Do what? You think I came here to ruin your night? Please. That's the kind of crap you'd pull, not me." I put the drink down and turned to face him. "Patrick, seriously, can we just leave it alone? I don't want to argue with you." He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms like he had all the time in the world. "Yeah, that's what you always say, isn't it? Just leave it alone. Let you have your way, like always. Never mind the people you screw over in the process." I felt my temper starting to slip, but I bit it back. "I'm going back to the party," I said, brushing past him. For a while, I thought that would be the end of it. I went back to the living room, rejoined the group, and tried to shake off the conversation. But Patrick wasn't done. I don't know how long he'd been standing behind me, but I heard his voice loud and clear over the music and chatter. Some people just love using their friends until they don't need them anymore. Everyone went quiet. My face burned as I turned around to see him standing there, his drink sloshing in his hand. He was staring right at me. "Are you talking about me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He shrugged, that smirk on his face again. If the shoe fits. That was it. The room felt like it was closing in around me, and I couldn't stop myself from walking toward him. "What the hell is your problem, Patrick?" I said, my voice louder than I meant it to be. A few people started to shuffle awkwardly, pretending not to watch, but their eyes were locked on us. Patrick didn't back down. He tilted his head, his smirk turning into something uglier. "My problem? Oh, come on. You're the one who's been walking around all night pretending I don't exist. You think you're so much better than everyone else, don't you?" I clenched my fists, trying to stay calm. "I didn't even want to deal with you tonight, Patrick. I told you to leave me alone. And yet, here you are, making it about you. Typical." My patience snapped. "You're unbelievable, you know that? You can't let go of anything. You want to ruin everyone else's night because you're bitter and miserable. Grow up." Patrick stepped closer, his drink spilling over the edge of his glass. "Say that again," he said, his voice dropping, the playful tone gone. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. "You heard me. Grow up." Before I could react, Patrick shoved me, hard, in the chest. I stumbled back, bumping into the coffee table, knocking over a bowl of chips. The room erupted in gasps. "Hey, knock it off!" someone shouted, but neither of us was listening anymore. I charged at him, shoving him back, harder than he'd pushed me. He hit the wall, and his drink fell to the floor, shattering. He lunged at me, and suddenly we were on the ground, fists flying. I don't even remember who threw the first punch. People were yelling, trying to pull us apart, but it was like a red haze had settled over me. All I could see was Patrick's face, his fists swinging toward me and the rage boiling over in my chest. I swung back, my knuckles colliding with his jaw, then his nose. Finally, someone grabbed me by the shoulders and yanked me off of him. I was breathing hard, my hands shaking, blood dripping from my knuckles. Patrick was on the ground, holding his face, blood trickling from his nose and lip. "Jesus Christ, you guys!" someone shouted. "What is wrong with you?" Patrick glared up at me, his voice thick and slurred. "You think you're the hero here? You're a goddamn coward." I wanted to go after him again, but someone was still holding me back. "Get him out of here," they said, shoving me toward the door. I stumbled outside into the freezing night air. My hands were throbbing, and my heart was still racing. I stood there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, the sounds of the party muffled behind the door. A minute later, 2 other people came out, looking at me like I'd lost my mind. "The cops are on their way," one of them said. "You might want to figure out what you're going to tell them." I stared at them, stunned. "The cops? Are you serious?" "Yeah, serious," they snapped. "Patrick's face is messed up and everyone saw you swinging at him. You think this is just going to go away?" I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but what was the point? I'd lost control. I let Patrick get under my skin, and now everything was falling apart. The cops showed up about 10 minutes later. By then, Patrick had come outside too, still holding his face and yelling about how I'd attacked him. I tried to explain my side, but it didn't matter. Someone had already told them I threw the first punch. They took statements, and then they took us both in. Sitting in the back of the squad car, the reality started to sink in. I wasn't just in trouble, I'd probably just wrecked my whole life over a stupid grudge. By the time they let me go the next morning, it was all over. Half our friend group was furious at me, and the other half didn't want anything to do with Patrick. Some of them blocked me outright. Patrick ended up pressing charges. I was facing assault charges, and even though I had a decent lawyer, the case dragged on for months. I ended up with a fine and a permanent mark on my record. Looking back, I don't even know why I let it get to that point. Patrick wasn't worth it. He never was. But I let my anger take over, and now I'm the one paying for it. So yeah, here's my advice. Don't let petty grudges control your life. They're not worth losing everything over. Trust me, I learned that the hard way. We were celebrating New Year's Eve at my place. The table was packed with snacks. Everyone was laughing and sharing jokes. Nothing felt off. It was the usual kind of gathering, with a mix of close friends and a few +1s. I'd thrown my wallet and keys on the shelf in the hallway as soon as I got home. No sense lugging them around all night while playing host. The place was small, but cozy, and it felt like the right vibe for a good time. As the evening went on, people were in and out of the kitchen, grabbing drinks or heading to the balcony to smoke. The playlist I'd put together was on point, and everyone seemed happy. The only thing that caught my attention, in a fleeting sort of way, was how one guy, Nick, a friend of a friend, kept to himself. He wasn't rude or standoffish, just quieter than most. I didn't think much of it at the time. Somewhere around midnight, we did the big countdown, everyone yelling and clinking glasses. It felt great. People hugging, snapping photos, the usual. After the initial chaos, the night started to mellow. A few people trickled out early while others hung around, lounging and chatting. That's when I went to the hallway to grab my phone charger. The shelf looked off. My wallet wasn't sitting in the exact spot I'd left it. For a split second, I thought maybe I'd knocked it over earlier. I picked it up, opened it, and immediately noticed something was wrong. The cash was missing. Not just a couple of bills, nearly all of it. A pit formed in my stomach. I looked around the hallway, as if someone might still be there, but it was empty. My heart started racing. Who would do this? Everyone here was supposed to be a friend or at least a trusted acquaintance. I thought about just letting it go, but the amount missing wasn't pocket change. This wasn't some drunk mistake. Someone had been in my things, and they knew what they were doing. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. I tried to stay calm and act normal. There were still people in the living room, laughing and talking, and I didn't want to ruin the mood just yet. But I couldn't ignore the knot in my stomach. I went back into the room, scanning everyone's faces. Did someone here really go through my wallet? I decided to test the waters. Casually, I asked, "Hey, did anyone see my wallet earlier? I think I might have left it somewhere else." Most people shrugged or shook their heads, barely paying attention. But one person, Nick, reacted differently. He glanced at me, quick and sharp, then looked away. It was subtle, but it stood out. I sat with it for a few minutes, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. I couldn't let it go. Finally, I stood up and cleared my throat. "Hey, I need to say something," I started, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think someone might have taken something from my wallet. If it was an accident or something, just return it, no questions asked." The room went quiet. People looked at me, confused and a little defensive. A couple of my closer friends chimed in, saying things like, "Are you serious? And who would do that?" But Nick? He froze. Then, suddenly, he spoke up, his tone sharp and defensive. "Why would you accuse us of something like that?" he snapped. "What, just because your stuff's missing, we're all suspects now?" His reaction was way over the top. Everyone else looked surprised at how angry he got, and honestly, it confirmed what I was already thinking. But I didn't want to point fingers outright, not yet. "I'm not accusing anyone," I said, trying to stay calm. "I just want whoever did it to make it right, that's all." Nick stood up, grabbed his jacket, and said, "I don't need to sit here and be treated like a thief." Then he stormed out. The room was dead silent after he left. One of my friends whispered, "That was weird," and I just nodded. But inside, I was fuming. It had to be him. Who reacts like that unless they're guilty? After everyone left that night, I sat in my empty apartment, replaying everything in my head. The whole thing felt surreal. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been violated, not just by losing the money, but by having someone I'd let into my home betray me like that. The next morning, I remembered something. My building had security cameras. I didn't know if they'd caught anything, but it was worth checking. I went down to the lobby and asked the building manager if I could see the footage from the night before. It took a while to sift through, but eventually, we found it. There he was, Nick, walking out of my apartment building, digging through my wallet as he stepped onto the sidewalk. My stomach dropped. There was no mistaking it. I filed a police report that same day. When they looked into him, it turned out this wasn't his first time. He'd been arrested before for petty theft and had a record stretching back a few years. Within a week, they'd tracked him down, and now he's facing serious charges. The fallout was messy. My group of friends was split down the middle. Some felt betrayed that I'd involved the cops, while others supported me completely. I started questioning who I could really trust, and honestly, I haven't hosted anything at my place since. The scariest part? This wasn't a stranger or some random break-in. It was someone I knew, someone I'd trusted enough to let into my home. It's a hard lesson to learn, but one I won't forget. Even the people you think you know can surprise you in the worst ways. We were having a low-key New Year's Eve at my apartment. Nothing fancy, just a few friends, some pizza, and a couple of bottles of champagne. The kind of thing you throw together last minute when no one has real plans. Everyone seemed to be in good spirits, joking around, laughing. It felt relaxed, even ordinary. Then Scott showed up. I wasn't super close to him. He was more of a friend, but he'd been invited, and I didn't mind. He came in with this plastic bag in his hand, one of those generic grocery store ones. I assumed it was more booze, maybe some snacks. He didn't say much about it, and I didn't think to ask. We settled into the usual party vibe. Music playing softly in the background, people chatting in small groups. At some point, someone put on one of those cheesy countdown shows on TV, and we all laughed at how over the top it was. Scott was quiet most of the time, sitting off to the side, scrolling on his phone. I noticed him whispering to a couple of the other guys. Nothing unusual. I figured they were just making plans for later, maybe another party or something. A couple of hours in, I realized Scott and two others, Ian and Jake, weren't in the living room anymore. At first, I thought maybe they'd stepped out for a smoke, but when I went to grab some chips from the kitchen, I found them there. The three of them were huddled together by the counter, and the second they saw me, Scott shoved something into his pocket so fast it was almost comical. "Everything okay?" I asked, pretending not to notice. Yeah, Scott said quickly. Too quickly. He was smiling, but his eyes darted around like he was checking if anyone else had seen. Ian and Jake didn't say anything. They just looked at each other, then back at Scott, like they were waiting for him to handle it. I could feel the air shift a little, something just off, but I didn't push. "Cool," I said, trying to keep it casual. I grabbed the chips and went back to the others, but my mind kept circling back to that moment, the way they froze when I walked in. The way Scott's hand had trembled slightly as he shoved whatever it was into his pocket. I started paying closer attention after that. Scott came back to the living room, but Ian and Jake stayed behind. A few minutes later, one of the girls went to get a drink and came back looking uneasy. "I think they're doing something sketchy in the kitchen," she whispered to me. I wanted to brush it off, say it wasn't a big deal, but deep down, I already knew she was right. Scott was acting jittery now. He kept glancing toward the kitchen, tapping his foot against the floor in a way that felt almost frantic. When he wasn't doing that, he was laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny, or zoning out completely like he wasn't even in the room with us anymore. I told myself it was none of my business, that everyone here was an adult and could make their own choices. But the more I thought about it, the more that nagging feeling grew. What if they weren't just messing around with a little weed or something harmless? What if it was something worse? By the time the clock hit 11, the vibe of the whole party had shifted. People were still talking, still laughing, but it felt thinner now, like everyone could sense the tension but didn't know how to name it. I caught Jake stumbling out of the kitchen at one point, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused. He grabbed a drink from the table and knocked it back like he was trying to drown whatever was eating at him. I went to find Scott again. This time, he wasn't in the living room or the kitchen. He was in my bathroom, the door locked. I knocked, pretending I needed to grab something. It took him a long time to answer. When he finally opened the door, his face was pale, his pupils blown wide, sweat dripping down his forehead even though it wasn't hot in the apartment. "Everything good?" I asked, keeping my voice even. Yeah, he said again, but his voice cracked on the second, "yeah." He brushed past me, heading straight back to the kitchen. I thought about stopping him, asking what the hell was going on, but I didn't. I just stood there watching him go. That was my mistake. A little after midnight, things took a turn. I was in the living room when I heard a loud crash from the kitchen, followed by a muffled yell. My heart jumped, and I ran to see what was going on. Jake was on the floor, his legs sprawled out awkwardly like a rag doll. Ian was leaning over him, shaking him and saying his name over and over, his voice rising with panic. Scott was standing off to the side, frozen, his face blank like he didn't know what to do, or maybe like he didn't want to deal with it. "What the hell happened?" I demanded, rushing to Jake. He was barely conscious, his head lolling to the side. His breathing was shallow, his lips tinged blue. Ian stammered something about Jake, just freaking out, but it was clear this was way more than that. Scott finally snapped out of it and started pacing. "Don't call anyone. Don't. He'll be fine. Just give him a minute," he said, his voice shaking. "No," I said firmly. "We're calling an ambulance." Scott whipped around, his eyes wild. "Are you kidding? If you call them, we're screwed. You don't get it, man. Just let him ride it out." I didn't care what Scott wanted. Jake wasn't just riding it out. I grabbed my phone, but Scott lunged at me, trying to snatch it away. "Don't! I'm serious," he yelled. "Back off," I snapped, shoving him away. Ian was still kneeling next to Jake, tears streaming down his face. "Do something, man," he begged Scott. But Scott was completely unhinged now, muttering about how we'd all get in trouble if anyone found out. I dialed 911 anyway. As soon as I started talking to the operator, Scott bolted. He didn't say a word, just grabbed his coat and the plastic bag and ran out the back door. The operator asked if Jake was breathing, and I had to check again to make sure. Barely. Ian was trying to keep him awake, slapping his face lightly and saying his name, but Jake wasn't responding anymore. The paramedics arrived in what felt like forever, but was probably only a few minutes. They immediately started working on Jake, checking his vitals, hooking him up to oxygen. One of them pulled me aside to ask questions. What had he taken? How long ago? I didn't know. I could only tell them what I'd seen. Ian broke down completely when they wheeled Jake out on a stretcher. The cops showed up not long after, and that's when things got even messier. They started asking questions too. Who brought the drugs? Did we know what it was? Where was the person responsible? All I could tell them was Scott's name. Ian gave them more details, shaky and stammering, about how Scott had shown up with some powder and talked them into trying it. Ian said he didn't even know what it was, just that Scott claimed it was safe and chill. Jake didn't come back that night. Around 3 a.m. I got a call from the hospital. He was alive but in critical condition. They'd managed to stabilize him, but he was in a coma. The doctor said it was a drug overdose, likely something laced with fentanyl. Scott was gone, completely vanished. His phone was disconnected. He deleted all his social media. The cops said they were looking for him, but I wasn't holding my breath. The next day, I sat in my trashed apartment, replaying everything over and over in my head. The signs I'd ignored, the moment I didn't step in sooner. The guilt hit me like a wave. I hadn't done the drugs, I hadn't brought them, but it was my apartment, my party. Jake stayed in the coma for weeks. He eventually woke up, but he wasn't the same. The damage to his brain was permanent. He couldn't speak clearly, couldn't walk without help. His family blamed everyone at the party, and honestly, I couldn't blame them. I haven't spoken to Scott since that night, but sometimes I wonder where he is, if he's still pulling the same reckless crap somewhere else. One thing's for sure, I'll never look at a harmless party the same way again. My parents were out of town for the holidays, leaving me with the house to myself for the first time ever. I thought it would be fun to have a few friends over for a chill night. Nothing crazy, just a small get-together. I spent the afternoon moving breakables out of reach, setting out some chips and soda, and making sure everything looked nice. It felt exciting, like I was finally getting a little taste of independence. By the time my first friends showed up, everything seemed perfect. We hung out in the living room, joking around, playing music at a reasonable volume. A couple of us played video games while the rest just chatted. It wasn't rowdy, it was exactly the kind of low-key vibe I'd hoped for. Everyone seemed to be having a good time, and I was proud of myself for pulling it off. But around 9 p.m., one of my friends, Ben, mentioned he'd invited a couple of other people. "They're chill," he said with a shrug when I looked at him. I didn't want to be rude, so I just nodded, even though it made me a little uneasy. The thing is, I didn't really know these people, and it's not like I'd invited them. I figured it'd still be fine as long as things didn't get out of hand. About 30 minutes later, the doorbell rang, and Ben's friends walked in. There were 3 of them, 2 guys and a girl, and they didn't even introduce themselves. One of them immediately asked where the drinks were. I told them we didn't have any alcohol, and they just laughed like I was joking. The girl pulled out a bottle of something from her bag and poured herself a cup without asking. I was too stunned to say anything, so I just stood there awkwardly while they made themselves comfortable. Soon, they started messaging their friends, and before I knew it, more people were showing up. They didn't even bother knocking, just walked right in. The atmosphere started shifting. My little gathering of close friends turned into something else entirely. It felt like the energy in the room was speeding up, and I wasn't sure how to slow it down. The noise level climbed quickly. Someone cranked up the music, and a few people started dancing, bumping into furniture I'd carefully moved out of the way earlier. Others lit cigarettes, despite me telling them not to smoke inside. I remember standing in the corner of the room, holding an empty cup, feeling like I'd lost control of the situation entirely. It was my house, but it didn't feel like it anymore. One of the new arrivals started going through my fridge like they owned the place, pulling out leftovers and laughing at whatever they found. Another guy, someone I'd never seen before in my life, was rooting through the cabinets in the kitchen. I asked him what he was doing, and he just mumbled something about looking for a bottle opener. I told him there wasn't any alcohol here, but he ignored me. The whole thing felt surreal, like I was watching it happen to someone else. The breaking point came when I heard the sound of glass shattering from another room. I rushed over to see what had happened and found 2 strangers, neither of whom I'd invited, arguing in the hallway. One of them had knocked over a lamp, and it lay in pieces on the floor. I started shouting at them to leave, but they just laughed and brushed me off. The angrier I got, the less anyone seemed to take me seriously. I wanted to call the police, but I hesitated. What would I even say? It felt embarrassing to admit I'd lost control of my own party, and besides, I didn't want to get my friends in trouble. Still, I could feel this growing pit in my stomach, like something bad was about to happen. It was no longer a question of if, but when. I was trying to figure out what to do when someone ran into me in the hallway, laughing hysterically. It was another stranger, stumbling drunk with a red plastic cup in hand. I grabbed his arm and tried to ask who he was, but he just shrugged me off, muttering something unintelligible before disappearing into the crowd. My heart was pounding now. I felt trapped in my own house. I decided to text Ben. "This is out of control. Tell your friends to leave. Now." He read the message but didn't reply. I spotted him a few minutes later, laughing with a group of people I didn't recognize. When I tried to talk to him, he brushed me off. "Relax, dude, it's fine," he said, grinning like nothing was wrong. But it wasn't fine. It was far from fine. The music was deafening. There were empty beer bottles scattered across the living room, and the smell of smoke, cigarettes, and maybe something else hung heavy in the air. I could barely move through the crowd of strangers, and I kept catching snippets of conversations about people posting my address online. My chest tightened. The thought of even more people showing up made me feel sick. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My bedroom door was wide open. I'd made a point of locking it earlier, but now it was ajar. I shoved through the crowd and ran upstairs, my heart racing. Inside, the sight stopped me cold. Drawers were pulled out, clothes were tossed everywhere, and my laptop, the one I'd saved up for months to buy, was gone. My wallet, which I'd stupidly left on the nightstand, was missing too. I could barely breathe. Someone had ransacked my room. This wasn't just a party spiraling out of control. This was theft. And it was happening right under my nose. I stormed back downstairs, yelling at people to leave, but my voice was drowned out by the chaos. Nobody cared. Nobody listened. A few people even laughed at me, like I was the punchline to some joke I didn't understand. I felt completely powerless. That's when the door burst open and 2 cops stepped inside. Someone, probably one of my neighbors, had finally called them about the noise. Half the room scattered immediately, bolting out the back door or climbing over the fence in the yard. The rest just froze, wide-eyed. I could feel every eye in the room on me. The officers looked around, their faces a mix of frustration and disbelief. "Whose house is this?" one of them asked, his voice stern. I stepped forward, my hands shaking. "It's mine," I said, barely able to get the words out. They started asking questions, but I could hardly focus. All I could think about was how my parents were going to kill me. The police made everyone leave, but not before giving me a lecture about underage drinking and endangering the neighborhood. They didn't arrest anyone, just told me they'd be filing a report. After they left, I was left standing in the middle of the wreckage. The house was trashed, furniture was broken, the carpet was stained, and cigarette burns dotted the couch cushions. My laptop and wallet were gone, and there were shattered glass and beer cans everywhere. It didn't even feel like my house anymore. It felt like a crime scene. When my parents came home the next day, I tried to explain, but they were furious. They didn't care that I hadn't planned for it to get so out of control. All they saw was the damage, the missing items, and the police report on the counter. I had to tell them about the stolen laptop and wallet too, which only made things worse. We didn't have insurance that covered something like this, so now I'm on the hook for paying for all the repairs and replacements. My parents don't trust me anymore. I don't even trust myself. It's been weeks, and I still haven't heard back from the police about my stolen stuff. I doubt I ever will. If there's one thing I learned, it's that letting 1 or 2 people into your house can spiral into something you can't take back. I thought I was just having a small, harmless party. Instead, I wrecked my relationship with my parents, lost hundreds of dollars worth of stuff, and got a harsh reality check about who I can and can't trust. It started innocently enough. A cozy holiday party at my friend Jake's place, string lights everywhere, a faint scent of pine, and that constant buzz of small talk layered over holiday music. I wasn't planning on staying long. Just show my face, have a drink, and leave. But then I saw him. Sam. Sam was leaning against the counter, laughing loudly at something. He was wearing this ridiculously flashy designer jacket, a shiny watch peeking out from the sleeve as he gestured. For a moment, I couldn't place why seeing him made my stomach twist. And then it hit me. The loan. A year ago, I'd lent him a significant amount of money when he was down on his luck. He promised to pay me back in a couple of months. Only he never did. I'd tried a few polite reminders early on, but he always had an excuse, and eventually, I let it go. Or at least I thought I had. But seeing him now, carefree and decked out in luxury, brought all of it rushing back. My chest tightened as I debated whether to approach him. Maybe I could just let it slide again. It was the holidays, after all. No need to cause a scene. But the longer I stood there, the harder it became to ignore. A few minutes later, I found myself sitting at the dining table, Sam directly across from me. He was holding court, bragging about some new gadget he'd bought, an absurdly expensive phone from the sound of it. I clenched my drink a little tighter. My mind kept flashing to the number in my bank app, the one I'd watched dwindle after loaning him that money. I told myself to leave it alone. I really did. But the words came out anyway. "Hey, Sam, speaking of money, when do you think you'll be able to pay me back?" The room went silent. I immediately regretted it. Sam paused mid-sentence and stared at me, his grin freezing in place. Then he waved a hand dismissively. "Not now, man. Don't ruin the vibe. It's the holidays." That answer lit something inside me. All that frustration I'd bottled up for the past year bubbled to the surface. "Ruin the vibe? You owe me thousands of dollars, Sam. It's been over a year." He gave an exaggerated sigh and leaned back in his chair. "Look, I'll get to it, all right? I've got a lot going on right now." His tone was casual, almost bored, like I was a pest buzzing in his ear. A few people around us exchanged uneasy glances. Jake, the host, awkwardly cleared his throat and tried to steer the conversation elsewhere, but I couldn't let it go. Not this time. Sam's dismissal was like gasoline on a fire. My hands clenched into fists under the table, and I could feel the heat rising in my face. "A lot going on? You're out here flaunting your new toys and acting like you don't have a care in the world. Meanwhile, I'm out thousands because I trusted you." "That's not right, Sam." His eyes narrowed, the smug grin slipping from his face. "You don't know what I've been through, all right? Back off. This isn't the time." "That's convenient," I shot back. "It's never the time with you." Sam slammed his drink down on the table, the sound sharp enough to make everyone jump. "You want to do this now? Fine. You loaned me money because I needed it. But you've been hounding me ever since. You think you're so perfect? You've never made a mistake?" The room had gone dead silent, all eyes darting between us. Someone muttered, "Guys, come on, it's Christmas," but I barely registered it. Sam's words didn't just sting, they made my blood boil. "You don't get to play the victim here," I said, my voice rising. "You've had a year to pay me back, and all I've gotten is excuses. You don't even care, do you?" Sam stood up, shoving his chair back so hard it nearly toppled. "You want to know why I haven't paid you back? Because I can't, all right? I've got debts, bills, and people breathing down my neck. You think I'm living the high life because of this jacket? It's fake, man. Just like you, pretending to be my friend when all you care about is money." That was it. I stood up too, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Don't turn this around on me. You lied to me, Sam. You used me. That's not friendship." He took a step closer, his voice low and tense. "You don't know a damn thing about my life." "And you don't seem to care about mine," I snapped. That's when it happened. He shoved me, hard. Instinctively, I shoved back. It all spiraled so fast. Chairs screeched, drinks spilled, and someone yelled for us to stop. Sam lunged at me, grabbing my shirt, and we stumbled backward into the living room. I pushed him off, but he tripped over the coffee table and fell. Time seemed to freeze for a moment as he crashed onto the glass surface. The sound of it shattering was deafening. For a second, I thought he was fine. just stunned. But then I saw the blood. A lot of it. His arm was twisted at an odd angle and crimson was pooling around the jagged shards beneath him. "Oh my God," someone gasped. A few people rushed forward, but I was frozen in place, staring at the scene in disbelief. Sam groaned in pain, clutching his arm, and someone shouted, "Call an ambulance." Jake was already dialing, his face pale. I dropped to my knees beside Sam, my anger evaporating in an instant. "I didn't mean, Sam, I'm sorry, I didn't mean for this to happen." He looked up at me, his face twisted in pain and something else. Anger, betrayal, maybe both. "Stay away from me," he hissed through gritted teeth. The next hour was a blur. The paramedics arrived, carefully extracting Sam from the glass and bandaging his arm before rushing him to the hospital. People whispered in hushed tones, avoiding eye contact with me. Jake pulled me aside, his expression a mix of worry and frustration. "What the hell were you thinking? This wasn't the time or place." I didn't have an answer. All I could think about was Sam's face as they wheeled him out and the blood on the floor. A few days later, I got a call from a lawyer. Sam was pressing charges. They were calling it assault, though I tried to explain it was an accident. Just an argument that got out of hand. Still, the damage was done. The damage. Sam's arm was severely injured, and there was talk he might lose some mobility in his hand. The guilt has been eating at me ever since. I keep replaying that night in my head, wondering how it spiraled so fast. Was it worth it? Over a debt? Over a stupid argument? If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Money and pride can destroy relationships faster than anything else. What started as a loan to help a friend ended with lawyers, medical bills, and shattered trust. I lost a friend that night, maybe more than one. And for what? It was Christmas Eve, and I was helping my sister wrap gifts for the kids in our family. The dining table was covered in rolls of wrapping paper, ribbons, and tags. She had been bustling around all day preparing for the big family dinner tomorrow, and this was the last thing on her to-do list. I volunteered to help since I wasn't great in the kitchen, but I could at least make a box look decent. We had Christmas music playing softly in the background, and the whole house smelled like cinnamon and cloves. It was the perfect holiday scene, except for one thing. My sister had gotten a weird gift earlier that afternoon, and it was sitting in the corner of the table. Someone had left a plain brown box on her porch with no note, no return address, nothing. At first, she thought it was something she ordered, but when she opened it, it wasn't anything she recognized. Inside was a knife, a plain, black-handled kitchen knife, wrapped in red tissue paper. She laughed it off as a joke, probably from one of her friends, and tossed it aside. But it unsettled me. "Are you sure it's from someone you know?" I asked her as I folded the corners on a box of Legos for her youngest. "Who else would it be? Probably Erin," she said, naming her co-worker who had a dark sense of humor. "She's always pranking me. Last year she sent me a jar of pickles with googly eyes on them." This felt different, though. A knife wasn't funny, not in the same way. I decided not to press her on it, though, since she clearly wasn't bothered. We kept wrapping gifts and chatting, but every time I glanced at that box, I felt a little knot in my stomach. It wasn't just the knife. It was how deliberately it was packaged. The tissue paper was crisp, and the box itself was sturdy and new. Whoever sent it had put thought into it, which made it creepier to me. At some point, my sister got up to refill our mugs of hot chocolate. I reached over and pushed the box farther into the corner of the table, out of my sight. I didn't want to look at it anymore. As soon as I touched it, though, I felt this weird urge to open it again. I know that sounds ridiculous, but it was like my curiosity got the better of me. I slid the lid off the box and pulled back the tissue paper. The knife was smaller than I remembered, almost like a paring knife, but the blade was sharp. Too sharp. I swear, when I brushed my finger lightly against the edge, it nicked my skin without me even pressing down. "Why are you messing with that thing?" my sister said as she came back into the room carrying 2 mugs. She looked annoyed. I don't know, it's just weird. Well, leave it alone. Erin's probably already laughing her ass off imagining you freaking out over it. I didn't say anything else, but the rest of the evening, I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling. It didn't help that my sister insisted on leaving the box on the kitchen counter. For the drama, when she saw Erin at work after the holidays. When I left her house later that night, I felt relieved to get away from it. I drove home through the quiet streets, the Christmas lights glowing softly in the cold air. But even as I pulled into my driveway, I couldn't stop thinking about that knife and who had sent it. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the scene with the knife in my head. Something about it just felt wrong. But my sister was so confident it was just a prank that I convinced myself I was overreacting. The next morning, I texted her to see how the family dinner prep was going, but she didn't reply. Not unusual, I thought. She was probably busy. Around noon, I tried calling her, but it went straight to voicemail. Again, nothing too weird. But by 2 p.m., when she still hadn't responded to a single message, I started to feel uneasy. I decided to swing by her place. When I pulled into her driveway, her car was there, but the house looked oddly still. No sounds, no movement. I knocked on the door and waited. No answer. I knocked harder and called out, "Hey, it's me!" Nothing. I fumbled for my spare key, the one she'd given me a few years back, and let myself in. The moment I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The Christmas music we'd been playing the night before was still on, but the house was eerily quiet otherwise. "Sis?" I called, walking toward the kitchen. My stomach churned when I saw the knife box still on the counter, but now the tissue paper was crumpled, like it had been opened again. Then I noticed something else. On the floor near the counter was a faint smear of blood. I froze. My brain scrambled for an explanation. Maybe she cut herself? Maybe she had to go to the hospital? But if that were true, why hadn't she called me? I followed the trail of blood, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. The smears led down the hallway to her bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. "Sis?" I pushed it open. She was there, slumped on the floor by her bed. Her hand was clutching her phone, and there was blood, so much blood, pooling around her. The knife, that stupid knife, was on the floor near her other hand. I dropped to my knees, shaking her. Hey, wake up!" She didn't respond. Her face was pale, her lips blue. My hands were trembling as I grabbed my phone and called 911. The next few minutes felt like hours. The operator walked me through CPR, but I couldn't get her to breathe. When the paramedics finally arrived, they pushed me aside and took over. I stood there in a daze, unable to comprehend what was happening. One of the paramedics turned to me. "Did she say anything before this happened?" "No," I stammered. I just found her like this. What's going on? Is she going to be okay?" He didn't answer. The police showed up not long after. They started asking me questions, and that's when it hit me. This wasn't just an accident. They weren't treating it like one either. The knife, the blood, the strange gift. Everything suddenly felt sinister. Later, I found out what had happened. My sister had been stabbed. Not by herself, but by someone else. The police said it looked like she'd been attacked in her kitchen and tried to crawl to her phone to call for help. The knife, that creepy gift, had been used as the weapon. The real kicker? Erin, the co-worker my sister had joked about, had nothing to do with the gift. When the police questioned her, she was just as shocked as I was. They eventually found the person responsible, a man my sister had briefly dated years ago. He'd been stalking her, leaving her gifts and escalating his behavior when she didn't respond. The knife had been his way of warning her. But she didn't know, and neither did I. I still think about that night all the time. About how close we were, wrapping presents and laughing, and how quickly everything fell apart. If I'd pushed harder about that gift, if I'd trusted my gut, maybe things would have turned out differently. Now, every holiday season, I can't help but feel uneasy. What looks like a harmless gesture might not be. Sometimes it's the little things, the things you almost ignore, that end up being the most dangerous. We were celebrating New Year's Eve at a friend's place in the suburbs. It was one of those cozy, picture-perfect nights. Champagne glasses clinking, the crackle of the fireplace, and everyone laughing over dumb jokes. You know the kind of night I mean. Nothing crazy, just a group of old friends unwinding after a long year. We'd all been looking forward to it, especially Andrew, who'd been stressed with work lately. Everything was going smoothly. We had music playing softly in the background, and the countdown was just over an hour away. Then, out of nowhere, Andrew stands up and announces he has to leave. The room sort of froze for a moment, like no one could process what he'd just said. "What do you mean, leave?" someone asked, half laughing, like they thought he was joking. But Andrew wasn't laughing. He started explaining, saying he needed to get back home to his girlfriend. Apparently, they'd had some sort of fight earlier, and now he wanted to fix it before midnight. The thing is, Andrew had been drinking, not to the point of being completely wasted, but enough that it was obvious he shouldn't be driving. A few of us immediately told him to just stay over. There were spare rooms, couches, whatever he needed. But he waved us off, saying he'd done this before, and it was no big deal. That didn't sit right with me. I've known Andrew for years, and he's always been the confident type, sometimes to a fault. But this time, it felt different. Like, there was this stubborn edge to him that I hadn't seen before. He wasn't just brushing us off, he was dead set on leaving. I pulled him aside and tried to reason with him. I told him straight up, "Man, it's not worth it, just stay. Talk to her tomorrow." But he just shook his head, muttering something about how she wouldn't wait, and he had to do this now. I could smell the alcohol on his breath while he was talking, and it just made me more anxious. The whole group got involved at that point, practically begging him to stay. One guy even offered to drive him home, but Andrew refused, saying it was too far out of the way and he'd be fine. It was frustrating. Like, you could see everyone was worried, but Andrew wasn't listening. He was just so sure of himself, like nothing bad could possibly happen to him. We thought we'd convinced him to stay at one point. He sat back down, and the conversation moved on. People started to relax again, thinking the whole thing was over. But then, while we were distracted, he grabbed his keys from the counter. By the time anyone noticed, he was already out the door. I ran after him, but he was moving fast. I shouted at him to stop, but he just turned around and waved me off, like it was some kind of joke. I remember the sound of his car starting. It was this low rumble that seemed way louder than it should have been. By the time I reached the driveway, he was pulling onto the street. I stood there for a minute, watching his taillights disappear into the dark. It was freezing outside, and I could feel the cold biting through my sweater, but I didn't move. I just stood there, staring down the empty road, feeling this knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. Something felt wrong. I went back inside, but the mood had shifted. Everyone was still trying to keep the night festive, but there was this undercurrent of tension. I couldn't stop thinking about Andrew. The way he'd just stormed out, the way he'd brushed us all off, it wasn't like him, not completely. A few others seemed uneasy too. One guy kept checking his phone, muttering about how he should have physically stopped Andrew from leaving. About 40 minutes later, the phone rang. It wasn't anyone we knew calling. It was a number from Andrew's hometown. The person on the other end introduced themselves as a passing driver. They'd seen Andrew's car wrecked on the highway and used his phone to call someone in his recent contacts list. I froze. They explained that Andrew's car had crossed into oncoming traffic. The driver didn't have all the details, but they said the crash was bad. Really bad. There were other vehicles involved, a minivan with a family inside. Ambulances were already on the scene, and the highway was shut down. I could barely process what they were saying. My head was spinning, and all I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I hung up and told everyone what I'd just heard. The room went dead silent. No music, no laughter. Just this crushing, suffocating stillness. We all piled into 2 cars and headed to the hospital they mentioned. The drive felt endless. Nobody spoke much, except for the occasional, "What the hell was he thinking?" or, "This can't be real." But it was real. When we got to the hospital, they wouldn't let us see Andrew right away. A nurse came out and told us he was alive, but in critical condition. Broken ribs, a collapsed lung, and some internal bleeding. He was barely hanging on. That news should have been a relief, but then the nurse added something that made my stomach drop. Unfortunately, the other driver didn't make it, she said. There were children in the minivan too. One of them is in surgery right now, and the other has a spinal injury. It's very serious. Hearing that was like getting punched in the gut. It wasn't just Andrew's life that was ruined. It was this entire family. Parents, kids, people who probably just wanted to get home and celebrate the new year like everyone else. And now their world was shattered because of one reckless decision. We stayed at the hospital for hours, not knowing what to do. At one point, the cops showed up to get a statement from Andrew, but he was still unconscious. One of them pulled us aside and asked if we'd known he'd been drinking. Nobody wanted to answer, but it was obvious. The officer just shook his head and said, "This is going to be a long road for him, and for a lot of people." The next few days were a blur. The news about the crash spread quickly, and it didn't take long for the family's story to come out. The driver of the minivan was a father of two. He died on impact. His wife was in the passenger seat and survived with minor injuries, but their two kids weren't so lucky. One of them, just 8 years old, was in a coma. The other, a 10-year-old, would never walk again. Andrew woke up 2 days later, but he wasn't the same. I visited him once before the trial started, and he could barely look me in the eye. He was haunted, and he knew what he'd done. He told me he didn't even remember the crash, just the sound of screeching tires and then darkness. The trial was brutal. The family pressed charges, and rightfully so. Andrew pled guilty to vehicular manslaughter and driving under the influence. He got a long sentence, but honestly, I think the guilt was a worse punishment than anything the court could have given him. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that I should have done more. We all should have. Taken his keys, stood in front of the door, something, anything. But we didn't, and now lives are ruined because of it. If you're reading this, please, never let someone you care about drive drunk. Fight them on it if you have to. Call the cops if it comes to that. It's not worth the risk. One bad decision can destroy so many lives. It's a lesson I'll carry for the rest of mine. I threw a New Year's party at our house, a cozy suburban spot just outside the city. It wasn't anything fancy, mostly neighbors and a few close friends. My wife and I wanted to keep it family-friendly, so we had the living room set up with cartoons for the kids while the adults hung out around the dining table, chatting over appetizers and wine. The vibe was great. Warm, cheerful, and exactly what we'd hoped for. Our son, Max, was running around with the other kids. He's 6, so he's got that endless energy thing going. He'd dart between the living room and the kitchen, always within earshot. Every once in a while, I'd glance up to check on him, and he was always there, laughing or shouting about something one of his friends did. Around 8 o'clock, we decided to gather everyone to open some gifts. We thought it'd be fun to do a mini gift exchange for the kids before the grown-ups settled into more serious conversation. I started calling everyone to the table, asking the kids to line up their presents under the little tree we'd set up in the corner. That's when I noticed Max wasn't in the living room anymore. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he'd gone upstairs to his room to grab a toy or something. I called his name and didn't get a response, so I figured he was just ignoring me, like kids do when they're caught up in their own world. I went to check upstairs, poking my head into his room, but it was empty. "Hey, hun, is Max with you?" I asked my wife as I came back down the stairs. She frowned and shook her head. "He was in the living room a few minutes ago," she said. The unease started to creep in, but I told myself not to overreact. Our house isn't huge, and it's not like there are a ton of places to hide. I started checking other rooms, bathroom, laundry room, even the garage. Nothing. By this point, I could feel the worry building in my chest. I asked a couple of friends if they'd seen Max, and soon everyone at the party was looking for him. We checked every corner of the house, closets, under beds, even the crawl space in the basement. The kids were getting antsy, and a couple of them started crying when they realized something was wrong. Maybe he went outside, someone suggested. It hit me like a punch to the gut. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and there was no way Max would last long out there without a coat. My wife and I ran to the back door, but it was locked from the inside. Relief washed over me for a second. If he didn't go out the back, maybe he hadn't left the house at all. Then I saw the front door. It wasn't fully closed, just cracked open, a sliver of cold air slipping through. I felt my stomach drop. My hands started shaking as I pushed the door open and stepped outside. The icy air hit me like a slap, but all I could think about was finding Max. I shouted his name into the dark, my voice cracking. No answer. My wife was right behind me, her voice frantic. "Max! Where are you?" Our friends and neighbors poured out of the house, spreading out across the yard. Someone grabbed flashlights and beams of light cut through the darkness. I ran to the driveway, scanning the street. It was quiet, eerily so. No cars, no distant chatter, just the crunch of snow underfoot as people searched. "Max!" I yelled again, my throat raw. "Max, please answer me!" Then I saw it. Tiny footprints in the snow, leading away from the house. My heart was racing so fast I could barely think. "They go this way!" I shouted, pointing. My wife grabbed my arm, her face pale with fear. "Where do they lead? Oh my God, where could he be going?" We followed the tracks down the sidewalk, the thin trail winding between patches of ice. The snow had started again, covering the prints as fast as we could follow them. I felt like I was running out of time. About 2 houses down, the footprints veered toward the side yard of an empty home. The house had been for sale for months, and no one had moved in yet. The windows were dark, and the yard was overgrown, even under the snow. I hesitated, the dread thick in my chest, but I pushed forward, calling out Max's name. "Here!" someone yelled behind me. I turned to see one of my neighbors pointing toward the backyard. I sprinted over, my boots slipping on the frozen ground. There he was. Max was sitting on the edge of a broken deck at the back of the house. He was curled into a ball, his arms wrapped tightly around his knees, staring at the ground below. I froze for a moment, my brain trying to process what I was seeing. "Max!" I shouted, but he didn't react. I climbed up onto the deck carefully, trying not to startle him. My wife was crying behind me, begging him to come back to us. As I got closer, I saw that his lips were blue and his little hands were trembling. He looked like he was in a trance, completely unaware of the danger he was in. "Hey, buddy," I said softly, forcing my voice to stay calm. "It's Daddy. Let's go inside, okay? It's cold out here." He still didn't respond. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I edged closer, my hand reaching out. Just as I was about to grab him, the deck shifted beneath me. One of the boards creaked loudly, and Max flinched. He turned his head slowly, and for the first time, he seemed to really see me. "It's okay," I said again. "I'm here. I've got you." I grabbed his arm and pulled him toward me, but as I did, the wood gave way under my feet. I slipped, grabbing onto the railing to stop myself from falling. Max screamed, and I managed to haul him into my arms just as the section of deck we were standing on collapsed. I don't know how I held onto him, but somehow we both ended up on the ground, tangled in the snow and broken boards. My neighbor was there in seconds, pulling Max out of my arms and wrapping him in a coat. My wife was sobbing, clutching him tightly as she checked him over for injuries. He was okay, cold and scared, but okay. The rest of the night was a blur. We got Max inside, wrapped him in blankets, and sat with him until he finally started talking again. He said he'd gone outside because he thought he saw a cat and wanted to follow it. When he got to the empty house, he got scared and didn't know how to get back. I couldn't stop shaking. The what-ifs kept running through my head. What if we hadn't found him? What if he'd fallen off the deck? That was the last time we let our guard down during a party. Now, I double-check every door and window, and I don't take my eyes off Max for a second. One moment of distraction could have cost us everything. We rented a small cabin in upstate New York for New Year's. Just me, my wife, and a couple of close friends. The idea was to escape the city chaos and have a quiet celebration. It felt almost like a scene from a holiday commercial. A roaring fireplace, homemade food, cozy blankets, and the kind of laughter that only comes with being around people who know you well. Everything was low-key and perfect. We had just finished dinner, a mix of potluck dishes we all contributed to, and settled in the living room to play board games. The vibe was calm, relaxed. There was snow outside, and we were wrapped up in our own little bubble, enjoying the simplicity of it all. At some point, one of my friends, Mark, suggested opening the bottle of champagne we'd been saving for midnight. He wanted to pop it early because we were too full to wait after the meal. We all laughed and went along with it. As I went to grab the bottle from the kitchen, I noticed something odd. There was a box sitting on the counter that I didn't recognize. It was wrapped in bright red paper with a white ribbon tied neatly around it. I thought maybe one of our friends had brought it as a surprise gift, but when I called out to ask, no one claimed it. "Not mine," said Mark. "Maybe it's from the cabin owners, like a welcome gesture or something?" It was a reasonable explanation, but I still felt uneasy. The wrapping paper was clean and crisp, like it had just been placed there, not like it had been sitting for days waiting for us to arrive. My wife, Sarah, shrugged it off and told me to open it. "What's the worst that could happen? It's probably a bottle of wine or something," she joked. But for some reason, I hesitated. I couldn't explain it, but something about that box felt off. We left it alone for the moment and moved back to the living room. Midnight was approaching, and the idea of fireworks in the snow sounded too good to pass up. So we bundled up, grabbed our glasses of champagne, and headed out to the porch. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that burns your lungs a little when you breathe. From the porch, we could see faint bursts of fireworks in the distance. It wasn't as dramatic as being in the city, but it had its own charm. As we were standing there, something caught my eye. Off in the woods, maybe 20 or 30 feet away, I noticed a man. He was short, stocky, and bundled in a heavy coat with the hood pulled low. At first, I thought it might be a local out for a walk, but he wasn't moving. He was just standing there, watching us. "Hey, you guys see that?" I asked, keeping my voice low so I wouldn't alarm anyone. "What?" Sarah asked, looking where I pointed. By then, the man had stepped back into the shadows, almost like he didn't want to be seen. "Probably just someone from another cabin," she said, trying to sound casual, but I could hear the tension in her voice. Mark, always the jokester, laughed it off. "What? You think it's the abominable snowman? Relax. This is the safest place we could be." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The way the man just stood there, staring, felt deliberate. I spent the rest of the night trying to push the image out of my head. By the time we got back inside, I had almost convinced myself that I was overreacting. After all, people watch fireworks all the time. Maybe he just didn't want to interrupt us. But then, as I was heading back to the kitchen to grab some water, I noticed the box again. It was still sitting there, untouched. And this time, I noticed something I hadn't before. The paper wasn't just red. It had tiny white dots on it, like snowflakes. It wasn't the kind of generic wrapping paper you'd pick up at the store. It looked handmade. I reached out to touch it, but stopped myself. Something about it felt wrong. Instead, I went back to the living room and quietly mentioned it to Sarah. She looked at me like I was being paranoid. "It's just a gift," she said. "You're freaking yourself out over nothing." Maybe she was right. But the rest of the night I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that man again. Later that night, everyone went to bed. The fire was dying down, and the house felt colder, quieter. I tried to shake off the weird feeling from earlier, but every creak of the wooden floor or groan of the old cabin made me sit up and listen. Sarah was asleep next to me, breathing softly, but I was wide awake, staring at the ceiling. At some point, I heard it, a faint shuffling sound coming from the kitchen. At first, I thought it was just the wind rattling the windows, but then it came again. This time, it was unmistakable. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. My chest tightened, and my first thought was that the man I saw in the woods was now inside the cabin. I got up as quietly as I could and grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand. I didn't want to wake Sarah until I knew what was going on. The hallway was pitch black, and every step I took made the floor creak under my weight. The sound of my heart pounding in my ears was deafening. When I reached the kitchen, the first thing I noticed was that the back door was slightly open. I was sure we had locked it earlier. The second thing I saw was the red-wrapped box. Only now, it was sitting on the floor, unwrapped. The paper and ribbon were scattered around it, and inside the box was a small, rusted hunting knife. I froze. It was such a strange and specific thing to leave as a gift. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. That's when I heard another sound, a low creak coming from the living room. I turned the flashlight toward the sound and saw him, the man from the woods. He was standing just inside the doorway to the living room, partially hidden in the shadows. His face was pale, his eyes wide and glassy, like he was on something. He didn't say anything, just stared at me with this strange, vacant expression. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaky. "What do you want?" He didn't answer. Instead, he took a slow step toward me. I panicked, yelling for Sarah and Mark to wake up. The sound of my voice must have startled him because he lunged forward, grabbing the knife from the box. I barely had time to react before he was coming at me. I swung the flashlight as hard as I could and hit him in the side of the head. He stumbled, dropping the knife, and I ran toward the hallway, screaming for everyone to get up. Doors flew open, and Sarah and Mark came out, confused and half asleep. I yelled for them to grab their phones and call the police. The man was back on his feet, moving erratically like he was disoriented. Mark, who's bigger and stronger than me, tried to block him from coming down the hallway, but the guy was relentless. He shoved Mark into the wall and bolted for the back door. We didn't follow him. Instead, we locked every door and window in the cabin and waited for the police to arrive. The whole time I kept thinking about how he had gotten in. We'd been so careful. Or at least, I thought we had. When the police finally showed up, they found footprints in the snow leading from the woods to the back door, and then back again. It turned out the lock on the back door was faulty. He must have been watching us from the woods earlier, waiting for the right moment to slip inside. The officers also found something else. Several empty gift boxes scattered around the tree line. It seemed like he had been using the boxes to lure people in or distract them. We weren't his first targets, but thankfully, no one had been seriously hurt in the other incidents. That said, the man himself was still out there, and they didn't have enough information to track him down that night. We packed up and left the cabin first thing the next morning, cutting our trip short. None of us felt safe staying there after what had happened. I couldn't stop thinking about how things might have gone differently if I hadn't been awake to hear him moving around. Now, every holiday season, I double-check every door and window, no matter where I am. And I'll never ignore that gut feeling when something doesn't seem right. The whole thing still keeps me up at night sometimes, wondering what would have happened if we hadn't been so lucky. Because of my job, I barely had time to prepare for New Year's Eve. I knew I couldn't manage cooking an entire dinner from scratch, so I opted to buy a bunch of ready-made dishes from this local gourmet deli. Everything looked fantastic. Creamy pasta salad, a perfectly roasted turkey, potato salad loaded with fresh herbs. It all smelled amazing, and I figured it would save me a ton of effort while still impressing my friends. By 7 p.m., the table was set, the food was laid out, and the guests started arriving. There were about a dozen of us, close friends and a few coworkers. Everyone seemed excited. We popped a bottle of champagne, passed around appetizers, and settled in for what felt like a carefree, festive evening. I'll admit, I felt a little proud when people complimented the food. "This pasta is incredible," one of my friends said, reaching for seconds. Even though I didn't cook it myself, it felt good hearing everyone enjoy it. The atmosphere was relaxed and happy, with music playing softly in the background and laughter filling the room. But about 2 hours in, something shifted. It started with Sarah, one of my coworkers, quietly excusing herself from the table. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming she just needed some air or a quick bathroom break. Then someone else, David, I think, mentioned feeling a little off. He shrugged it off like it wasn't a big deal, but his expression was uneasy, like he couldn't quite put his finger on what was wrong. It was subtle at first, easy to dismiss. But then Sarah returned, looking pale, and whispered to me that she felt really nauseous. A pit started forming in my stomach, but I forced a smile and told her to lie down for a bit. "You probably just overdid it on the champagne," I joked, but my voice sounded hollow, even to me. 15 minutes later, another guest said they felt sick, then another. It was like a domino effect. Someone mentioned a weird, lingering taste in the potato salad. My mind raced. Could the food really be bad? It didn't seem possible. Everything had been freshly bought that morning, and the deli had great reviews. But now the room felt heavier, like the tension was palpable. It wasn't long before the situation spiraled out of control. Sarah, who was lying down on the couch, suddenly bolted upright and ran to the bathroom. A few seconds later, we could hear her vomiting. The sound made my stomach turn. But I didn't have time to dwell on it because David doubled over in his chair, clutching his stomach. His face was pale, almost gray. Panic was setting in among the group. One by one, people started complaining of nausea, dizziness, and stomach pain. Some were sweating heavily, while others looked disoriented. "What's happening?" one of my friends blurted out, his voice trembling. No one had an answer. I tried to stay calm and take control of the situation, but my hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone to call an ambulance. The operator asked me a lot of questions. How many people were sick? What they'd eaten? If anyone had passed out? I glanced around the room and realized it was worse than I'd thought. Sarah hadn't come out of the bathroom. David was now lying on the floor, groaning in pain. And then another guest, Mia, slumped forward onto the table, unconscious. "They're dropping like flies," someone muttered, their voice cracking. It felt surreal, like I was watching a disaster unfold in slow motion. The paramedics arrived in what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes. By then, 2 more people were vomiting violently, and others were too weak to stand. The living room had turned into a scene from a nightmare. People sprawled out on the furniture and floor, pale and sweating, while the smell of food and sickness hung heavy in the air. The paramedics immediately began triaging everyone, asking questions I couldn't fully answer. I tried to explain about the food, how it was store-bought, how everything had seemed fine just a few hours ago. They exchanged looks that only made me feel worse. "Food poisoning," one of them said grimly, shaking his head. "Could be salmonella, could be something worse. We need to get them to the hospital." Several guests were loaded into ambulances, including Sarah, David, and Mia. I followed in my car, feeling sick with guilt. It was supposed to be a happy night, a celebration, and now my friends were being rushed to the ER because of food I'd served them. At the hospital, things got even more serious. The doctors confirmed it was a severe case of food poisoning, and lab tests suggested contamination with something more dangerous than salmonella. 2 of my friends were put on IV fluids for dehydration. Mia, the one who had passed out, had developed kidney complications. The next few days were a blur of hospital visits, phone calls, and questions from health officials. The local health department got involved and traced the outbreak back to the deli where I'd bought the food. It turned out they'd had a refrigeration issue earlier in the week that had compromised several items, but they hadn't caught it in time. I couldn't shake the guilt. I'd trusted that the food was safe, and because of that, my friends had suffered. Even weeks later, the weight of what happened stuck with me. Mia recovered but needed ongoing monitoring for her kidney function. Sarah couldn't even think about eating potato salad without feeling sick to her stomach. I learned my lesson the hard way. Now, every time I plan a gathering, I obsess over the food. I double-check expiration dates, read reviews, and even cook everything myself just to be safe. I'll never forget the look on my friends' faces that night, the fear, the pain. It's a New Year's Eve none of us will ever forget, and not in a good way. It was supposed to be a celebration. Instead, it was a nightmare. We decided to rent a small house for Christmas in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was one of those cookie-cutter areas where every home looked the same, with neatly trimmed lawns and twinkling lights strung along the rooftops. The plan was simple: a low-key celebration with close friends, a few drinks, and exchanging quirky gifts. Nothing crazy. The night started exactly as we'd imagined. There were about 8 of us, all gathered in the cozy living room, surrounded by piles of wrapped presents under a fake tree. We had soft music playing in the background and enough snacks to feed a small army. After a while, we started the gift exchange. The rule was simple. Everyone brings a weird or funny gift, and we take turns opening them. I ended up with a mug shaped like a toilet, which got everyone laughing. It was lighthearted and fun, exactly what we all needed after a stressful year. Then came Dan's turn to open his gift. He unwrapped a small box with a cheap-looking ornament inside, nothing special. But underneath the ornament was a folded piece of paper. At first, we thought it was just part of the packaging. Dan opened it up and started reading, and his face went pale. "What does it say?" someone asked. Dan hesitated, then handed the note to me. It was written in messy, almost frantic handwriting. The note read, "Enjoy the holidays. You'll see me soon." Everyone thought it was a joke, part of the gag gift. I laughed nervously and said, "Nice touch, whoever did this. Real creepy." But the weird thing was, no one admitted to it. We all started pointing fingers, asking who brought the box. The guy who brought it, Steve, swore he bought it at some secondhand store a few days earlier. "I didn't put that note in there," he said, looking genuinely confused. "I just thought it was funny because it was ugly as hell." We tried to laugh it off, but something about the note stuck with me. I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling, like someone was watching us. A couple of the others felt it too, but we didn't want to ruin the mood, so we kept the party going. By the time it was close to midnight, the house was starting to feel stifling. A few people had gone outside to smoke, so I decided to join them. The street was eerily quiet, with only the occasional car passing by. It was one of those nights where the cold air bites your skin and your breath hangs in the air like smoke. As we stood there, huddled together, I caught a glimpse of something, or someone, standing at the far end of the street, just outside the glow of a street lamp. "Hey, do you see that?" I asked the others, pointing in the direction of the figure. They squinted, but by then, whoever, or whatever, it was had moved out of sight. "Probably just a neighbor," one of them said, brushing it off, but my stomach was in knots. It didn't feel right. We went back inside, and I tried to shake the feeling. The atmosphere had shifted slightly. People were still talking and laughing, but there was an edge to it now. Every little sound seemed louder, every shadow sharper. I caught myself glancing out the window more than once, half expecting to see someone staring back at me. Then, around 1 a.m., the doorbell rang. Everyone froze. It was too late for anyone else to be stopping by, and we weren't being loud enough to attract attention from the neighbors. Or so I thought. Dan, still a little buzzed, volunteered to answer it. "Relax," he said, trying to sound confident. "It's probably carolers or something." As he opened the door, I stood behind him, craning my neck to see who it was. No one was there, just the empty porch and the icy night air. Dan stepped outside, looking around. "Weird," he muttered, before shutting the door. But there was something else, a small package sitting on the welcome mat. Dan picked up the package and brought it inside, holding it like it might explode. It was small and wrapped in plain brown paper, with no label or return address. "All right, who's messing with us?" he said, looking around. Nobody answered. "Maybe it's one of those neighborhood prank things," Steve suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "People do weird stuff on Christmas, right?" "Yeah, but this?" "At 1 in the morning?" I replied, my stomach twisting tighter. Dan, ignoring the growing tension, started tearing off the paper. "Let's just see what it is." Inside was a cheap wooden box. He opened it, revealing another folded note. This one looked even messier than the first, with smudges of what looked like dirt, or maybe dried blood. Dan read it out loud. "I told you, I'm closer now." Everyone went dead silent. Even Dan, who had been joking and brushing it off, looked shaken. "Okay, this isn't funny anymore," he said, dropping the note onto the coffee table. We all started talking at once, voices overlapping in panic. Who could have left it? Was it some kind of sick joke? Or worse, was someone actually outside watching us? I ran to the front window, pulling the curtain back just a sliver. The street looked empty, but my heart was racing so fast I thought I might pass out. "Should we call the police?" one of the girls, Sarah, asked, her voice trembling. "And say what?" Steve shot back. "That someone left a creepy note? They'll think we're drunk idiots." While we argued, Dan went to the back door to check if it was locked. Suddenly, he shouted, "Guys, come here!" We rushed to find him standing in the kitchen, staring out the back door's small window. There, just a few feet from the house, was a figure. Tall, motionless, barely visible in the dark, but unmistakably there. "Is that a person?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Dan pounded on the window. "Hey, who the hell are you? Get out of here!" The figure didn't move. It just stood there watching us. My whole body was screaming at me to run, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. "Call the cops," I finally managed to say, my voice shaking. Steve grabbed his phone and started dialing, but before he could finish, the figure turned and sprinted into the trees at the edge of the yard. Dan flung the door open, yelling after them, but I grabbed his arm and pulled him back. "Don't! What if they have a weapon?" By the time the police arrived, the person was long gone. We explained everything, about the notes, the package, the figure in the yard. The officers searched the area but didn't find anything. One of them, a tired-looking guy in his 40s, said it was probably just a prank. "Teenagers pulling a holiday scare," he said with a shrug. But the way he avoided making eye contact told me he didn't really believe that. The cops left, and we tried to calm down, but nobody was in the mood to celebrate anymore. A few people even decided to leave, saying they didn't feel safe. I couldn't blame them. Around 3 a.m., the house was quiet, with just Dan, Sarah, Steve, and me still there. We locked all the doors and windows and decided to crash in the living room together. Safety in numbers, right? I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember is waking up to a soft tapping sound. Tap, tap, tap. My heart started racing again as I realized it was coming from the front door. Dan was already awake, sitting up on the couch, staring at the door. "Don't," I whispered as he got up. But he ignored me. He crept to the door and looked through the peephole. "There's nothing there," he said, but his voice didn't sound convinced. He unlocked the door and opened it just a crack. A knife came through the gap, slashing wildly. Dan yelped and stumbled back as the door was shoved open, slamming against the wall. A man burst into the room, his face covered by a ski mask. He was holding a long hunting knife, and his movements were frantic, almost animalistic. "Stay back!" Dan shouted, grabbing a lamp and swinging it, but the guy ducked and lunged at him. Steve tackled the man from the side, trying to wrestle the knife away. Sarah was screaming. I ran to grab something, anything, I could use as a weapon. My hands found a heavy glass ashtray, and I hurled it at the guy's head. It hit with a sickening thud, and he went down. We didn't wait for him to get back up. Steve grabbed the knife and tossed it across the room while I called 911. The man was groaning on the floor, clutching his head, but he was still trying to crawl toward the knife. When the police arrived, they found zip ties, duct tape, and a taser in his jacket pocket. He wasn't just here to scare us. He had planned to do something much worse. The cops told us later that the guy had been stalking the neighborhood for weeks. He'd broken into another house down the street a few nights earlier, but no one had been home. We were lucky. If we hadn't fought back, who knows what could have happened. I can't stop thinking about how quickly everything spiraled. One minute we were laughing and exchanging gifts. The next, we were fighting for our lives. It's the kind of thing you never think will happen to you, until it does. I invited a few close friends over to celebrate New Year's Eve at my apartment. I wanted something low-key, just a small gathering with people I trusted. Among the guests was Connor, a friend who'd been in the States for years, but had Russian roots. He was known for drinking a little too much at parties, and I'd seen it get out of hand before. Still, I figured with a small group and a relaxed vibe, things would stay under control. I didn't think too much about it. The evening started out great. We had music playing softly in the background, some snacks on the table, and a bunch of cheap decorations I'd put up earlier. People were chatting and laughing, and the mood was light. Connor showed up with a bottle of something strong, a Russian vodka he said was the real deal. He poured everyone a shot to toast, and honestly, it felt like a nice way to kick off the night. By 9, we'd all had a couple of drinks, but Connor was already pouring himself more than anyone else. It was subtle at first. He'd top off his glass when no one was paying attention. Then he started making jokes, louder and less coherent as the night went on. I noticed him slurring his words a bit, but I shrugged it off. It was New Year's Eve, after all. Around 10 p.m., he knocked over his glass, spilling vodka all over the coffee table. I grabbed a towel to clean it up while he laughed it off and poured himself another drink. "Connor," I said, keeping my tone light but firm. "Maybe slow down a little." He waved me off. "I'm fine," he said, grinning. "It's a party." But I could see things were going downhill. He was starting to stagger when he walked, and his jokes were becoming more random, almost nonsensical. I felt a twinge of unease, but told myself he'd probably just crash on the couch and sleep it off like he had at other parties. I didn't want to ruin the mood by making a big deal out of it. Then, out of nowhere, Connor said he needed some air and headed for the balcony. He was unsteady, almost tripping over the carpet as he made his way out. I followed him halfway, calling out, "Connor, you good?" He waved me off again, pulling the sliding door open and stepping into the cold night air. That was the first moment I felt something was off. I kept an eye on Connor through the glass door. He was leaning against the balcony railing, looking out into the dark. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and he wasn't wearing a coat. I thought about going out there to talk to him, but he didn't seem in the mood for a conversation. I figured he just needed a few minutes to clear his head. I turned back to the party, trying to relax and focus on the other guests. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my stomach. Every now and then, I glanced toward the balcony. Connor was still out there, swaying slightly, gripping the railing with one hand. I told myself he was fine. He was a grown man after all. A loud crash broke through the buzz of conversation. Everyone froze, looking toward the balcony. For a split second, I thought maybe Connor had dropped something, but then I heard it. A horrible, guttural scream. It didn't even sound human at first. I ran to the sliding door and yanked it open. The icy air hit me like a wall, but that was nothing compared to what I saw. Connor was on the ground, crumpled near the base of the railing, a dark pool of blood spreading out from his head. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly up at the sky. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. "Oh my God! Oh my God!" someone behind me screamed. I snapped out of it and dropped to my knees next to Connor. He was groaning, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His head had struck the sharp edge of the metal railing on the way down, leaving a deep, jagged wound. Blood was everywhere. On his face, his hands, the icy concrete. I could feel the heat of it soaking into my jeans as I tried to steady him. "Connor, stay with me," I said, my voice shaking. He tried to push himself up, but his arms gave out, and he collapsed back to the ground. "I'm fine," he mumbled weakly, the words barely audible. He wasn't fine. His eyes were fluttering shut, and the blood just kept coming. Someone yelled to call 911. Another guest ran inside to grab towels. I pressed one against Connor's head, trying to stop the bleeding. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it in place. "Come on, man, hang in there," I kept saying, more to myself than to him. The paramedics arrived faster than I expected, but those minutes felt like hours. They moved me aside and worked on Connor, their faces grim and focused. One of them asked me what had happened, but I could barely form a sentence. He slipped," I stammered. "He was drunk, and he slipped." They lifted Connor onto a stretcher, and I caught a glimpse of his face. It was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were closed. The blood had soaked through the towels and was dripping onto the floor as they carried him out. The party was over, of course. Everyone left in a daze, murmuring half-hearted condolences as they stepped around the bloodstains on their way out. I stayed behind, staring at the mess, unable to move. The next day, I got a call from the hospital. Connor had survived the night, but the news wasn't good. He'd suffered a severe brain injury from the fall, and the doctors weren't sure if he'd ever fully recover. There was a chance he'd be permanently paralyzed on one side of his body. I hung up the phone and sat in silence for a long time. My apartment still smelled like vodka and blood, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw Connor lying on the cold concrete, his head split open. It's been a few weeks now, and I still can't shake the guilt. I keep replaying that night in my head, wondering if I could have done something to stop it. Should I have cut him off earlier? Pulled him back inside before he got to the balcony? Called someone for help the second I saw him swaying? I don't know. All I know is that a night that was supposed to be about celebrating turned into the worst moment of my life. I haven't touched a drink since, and I never will again. We pulled out the old holiday lights from storage, the ones that had been gathering dust on the top shelf of our closet for years. They were the kind with those colorful glass bulbs that scream nostalgia. My mom said she'd used them back when I was a kid. We tested them quickly, plugging them into the nearest outlet. The bulbs flickered to life, and the wires seemed intact at first glance. It felt good to finally get into the holiday spirit. We strung them around the apartment, framing the windows and wrapping the string around the Christmas tree in the corner of the living room. The tree looked amazing, maybe even better than I expected. We were in high spirits, sipping cocoa and joking about how nothing says Christmas like old-school decorations. Nobody gave a second thought to the age of the lights. I mean, who really checks that stuff? They worked. That's all that mattered, right? If anything, we were more worried about the cats swatting at the ornaments than the lights themselves. The evening went on like any other. A couple of friends stopped by to drop off gifts, and we laughed and reminisced over holiday memories. By the time it hit midnight, things had quieted down. My boyfriend and I were sitting on the couch scrolling through our phones, with the glow of the lights giving the room that cozy, warm vibe. That's when I noticed it. This faint, odd smell. At first I brushed it off. Maybe someone left a candle burning, or maybe it was coming from the neighbors cooking. You know how apartment buildings are. But it didn't go away. It got stronger. I sniffed the air, trying to place it, and my stomach dropped when I realized what it was. It smelled like burning plastic. I sat up straight, my heart racing. "Do you smell that?" I asked my boyfriend, who was still staring at his phone. He gave a distracted nod but didn't seem concerned. I got up and started pacing the room, sniffing the air like some sort of bloodhound. The smell was stronger by the tree. That's when I saw it. A thin wisp of smoke curling up from one of the light strands. My stomach knotted as I leaned in for a closer look. One of the bulbs was glowing brighter than the others, almost too bright, and the plastic around the wire was starting to bubble. "Unplug it!" I shouted. My boyfriend jumped up, startled by my tone. Before he could even react, I heard a sharp pop and saw a spark fly from the strand. It hit the lower branches of the tree, and in what felt like the blink of an eye, the dry needles caught fire. Panic set in immediately. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a throw pillow, and tried to smother the flames, but it was useless. The fire spread faster than I thought possible, licking up the branches and sending more sparks onto the carpet. "Get the fire extinguisher!" I yelled, my voice cracking. My boyfriend darted to the kitchen, yanking open cabinets in a frantic search. I tried to pull the burning strand of lights off the tree, but the plastic was melting, and the heat was unbearable. The room filled with thick, acrid smoke, making it hard to breathe. By the time he got back with the extinguisher, the fire had spread to the curtains. He fumbled with the pin, cursing under his breath, and finally managed to spray the chemical foam at the base of the flames. It worked, sort of. The tree was out, but the carpet and curtains were still smoldering. Then we heard it, a crackling sound coming from the wall. Smoke was now seeping out from the electrical outlet where the lights had been plugged in. The short circuit must have spread through the wiring. I grabbed my phone and called 911, barely able to get the words out through the smoke and my panic. The dispatcher stayed calm, but I could hear the urgency in her voice as she told us to evacuate the apartment immediately. We ran out into the hallway, coughing and wheezing. By the time the firefighters arrived, the smoke had grown so thick that the windows were almost completely blacked out. They worked quickly, breaking through part of the wall to stop the fire from spreading to other apartments. When it was all over, the damage was devastating. The living room was gutted. Charred furniture, melted decorations, and a tree that looked more like a blackened skeleton than a festive centerpiece. Worse, the fire had compromised the wiring in the entire building. It would take weeks of repairs before anyone could move back in. The worst part? The insurance wouldn't cover it. Turns out the lights were so old that they didn't meet modern safety standards, and that technicality voided our claim. We were left with the repair costs, which were astronomical. I couldn't shake the guilt for weeks. All because I didn't think to check the condition of those lights before plugging them in. Now, every holiday season, I'm the person who triple checks every string of lights and every outlet. It's become an obsession, but after what happened, I don't think I'll ever be able to take that risk again. So, if you're reading this, take my advice. Check your decorations. And if they're old, just toss them. No nostalgic glow is worth losing everything over. I live in a small American suburb where every year, the neighbors throw a big New Year's Eve party. This time, we decided to combine our gatherings and meet at their spacious house with a large backyard. It was a casual, easygoing crowd, mostly people I knew from the neighborhood, with a few new faces. The air was filled with laughter, the clinking of beer cans, and the smell of barbecue wafting in from the patio. Everything felt cheerful and ordinary. By about 10:30, people were starting to loosen up. A small group had gathered in the living room near the fireplace, swapping stories and joking loudly. Others lingered near the buffet table, piling their plates high with snacks. I was sitting on the couch with a couple of friends, watching someone demonstrate an admittedly bad card trick when a man I didn't recognize sat down in the armchair across from us. He looked like he might be in his late 30s, with a cocky grin and a confidence that suggested he wasn't shy around strangers. "Hey, I'm Jake," he said, interrupting the trick. "Friend of Mark's from work." Mark was the host. I gave him a polite nod but didn't think much of it. He seemed friendly enough, though a little too eager to dominate the conversation. Jake started talking about his hobbies, fishing trips, and, surprisingly, guns. "I've got a license, of course," he said with a laugh. "Gotta keep things legal, right?" He looked around as though expecting applause. Nobody seemed overly interested, but Jake didn't need much encouragement. He kept going, dropping comments about the models he owned, the ranges he visited, and how important it was to be prepared. The conversation started to make me uneasy. I'm not particularly anti-gun, but something about the way he talked about them felt off. He didn't sound cautious or respectful. He sounded like he thought they were toys. I glanced at my friend Sarah, who raised an eyebrow at me, clearly thinking the same thing. A little while later, Mark, the host, wandered over and caught part of the conversation. He laughed and said, "Jake's always got his gun talk. Hey, why don't you show everyone what you're so proud of?" It was a joke, obviously, but Jake lit up like a kid on Christmas morning. "Oh, you're on. Hold on, let me grab it." I sat up straighter. "Wait, you brought a gun here?" Jake shrugged. "It's in my car, totally legal. Relax, I'm not gonna shoot anyone." He said it like the idea was absurd, but something in his tone didn't sit right with me. "Jake, maybe leave it there. No need to bring it out at a party," I tried, but he was already halfway to the door. Mark waved me off, saying, "Don't worry about it. He knows what he's doing." But did he? I had no idea who this guy really was, and the idea of someone casually walking into a party with a gun didn't exactly scream safe to me. I stood up, intending to follow him out and maybe talk some sense into him, but Sarah pulled me back. "Just let it go," she whispered. "Mark's vouching for him. Don't make a scene." Against my better judgment, I sat back down. I could hear Jake outside, joking loudly with someone else as he opened his car. The chill in the air crept through the door, and I realized I wasn't the only one feeling it. The laughter and chatter inside had died down a little, as though the whole room could sense something shifting. Jake came back in holding a black case. He popped it open right there in the living room, revealing a sleek pistol nestled in foam. "Glock 17, he announced proudly, like he was showing off a new gadget. A couple of guys moved closer to take a look, and someone whistled. "Man, that's nice," they said. I didn't move. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. Something about the way Jake handled it, the casualness, the grin, made my stomach churn. He wasn't treating it like the deadly weapon it was. And then he said it. "Don't worry, it's unloaded." Mark, laughing nervously, told him to be careful. "You know, we've got kids upstairs," he added. Jake waved him off, insisting, "I know what I'm doing." But did he? The moment Jake said, "Don't worry, it's unloaded," my chest tightened. He waved the gun around like it was a prop, gesturing wildly as he joked about how he was the safest guy in the room. Every instinct in me was screaming that this was wrong. Guns, alcohol, and crowded rooms don't mix. I stood up, intent on saying something. But before I could, Jake took a stance like he was in an action movie, pretending to aim at a spot on the far wall. His finger hovered dangerously close to the trigger. "Hey Jake, cut it out," I said, my voice firmer this time. He turned to me, smirking. "Relax, buddy, I told you, it's unloaded," he said, cocking the slide for emphasis. The sound of the slide echoed through the room, silencing what little chatter was left. Everyone was watching now, frozen in various stages of unease. Jake either didn't notice or didn't care. He kept talking, cracking jokes about how he could hit a fly from here, and maybe I should join the police force. Mark tried to step in, his tone less jovial now. "All right, Jake, maybe put it away. You're making people nervous." Jake laughed it off, saying, "Come on, man. Everyone's too uptight these days. It's just a bit of fun." He aimed at the wall again and pulled the trigger. Click. The dry fire made me flinch. Others did too. Someone near the back of the room muttered, "This isn't funny." And then it happened. Jake, still grinning like an idiot, racked the slide again, probably to show off. But this time, the unmistakable gleam of a bullet chambering stopped my heart cold. "Jake!" I shouted, but it was too late. He turned back to the wall, raised the gun, and pulled the trigger. Bang! The sound was deafening, like a thunderclap in the confined space of the living room. For a split second, no one moved, no one spoke. Then came the screaming. The bullet had gone straight through the drywall and into the next room. We heard a loud crash, and then a voice, female, crying out in pain. Panic erupted. People were shouting, scrambling over each other to get to the door. "Oh my God, what did you do?" someone yelled. Jake stood there frozen, the gun still in his hand. His face had gone pale. It was supposed to be unloaded," he stammered, his bravado gone. Mark pushed past him and ran into the next room, with me close behind. The sight stopped me in my tracks. It was Katie, one of the younger guests, probably no older than 20. She'd been sitting on the floor near the wall, and the bullet had grazed her upper arm. Blood was everywhere. On her sweater, on the carpet. She was clutching her arm, sobbing, while a friend tried to press napkins against the wound. "Call 911!" someone shouted. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock it. The operator picked up, and I gave them the address, trying to stay calm as I described what had happened. Meanwhile, Jake was still in the living room, pacing and muttering. "I didn't know there was a round in it. I swear I didn't know." Mark stormed back in, his face red with fury. "You're a goddamn idiot, Jake. There are kids upstairs. What the hell were you thinking?" Jake tried to defend himself, but no one was listening anymore. The party was over. The police arrived first, followed by the paramedics. Katie was taken to the hospital. She was conscious, but the paramedics said she'd need stitches and might have permanent scarring. The sight of her being wheeled out on a stretcher made me sick to my stomach. The officers questioned everyone, but it didn't take long for Jake to admit what he'd done. He was arrested on the spot, the gun confiscated. Watching him being led out in handcuffs, I couldn't feel anything but anger and relief that it wasn't worse. If the bullet had hit just a little higher, or if one of the kids upstairs had come down at the wrong moment. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. Katie's injuries weren't life-threatening, thank God, but the image of her sitting there, bleeding and crying, haunted me. The sound of the gunshot replayed in my head every time I closed my eyes. It's been months now, but I can't shake the memory. Every time I hear about responsible gun owners, I think of Jake and how a few seconds of carelessness turned a fun night into a nightmare. I've got one rule now: no guns at parties. Ever. Every year, we celebrated New Year's Eve at my aunt's cozy house on the outskirts of town. It was sort of a family tradition, and honestly, I always looked forward to it. The house had that warm, nostalgic vibe: wood-paneled walls, a fireplace crackling in the corner, and the faint smell of baked goods that seemed to linger no matter the season. This year was no different. I got there early, like I usually do, to help out in the kitchen. Aunt Linda was already in full-on hosting mode, buzzing around the house and barking light-hearted orders at whoever dared to step in her path. I helped her peel potatoes and set up the drink table while the rest of the family started trickling in. By the time evening rolled around, the house was packed. My grandma had claimed her usual spot on the couch. My younger cousins were chasing each other around the dining table, and even some relatives I hadn't seen in years showed up, bringing their kids and spouses along for the chaos. The atmosphere was lively, but not overwhelming. People were laughing, sharing stories, and catching up over glasses of wine and plates stacked high with homemade food. My cousin Michael and his dad, Uncle Bob, were among the last to arrive. Michael looked a little worn out, but I chalked it up to the long drive from Ohio. Uncle Bob, on the other hand, was his usual stoic self, polished, reserved, always a bit on edge. They greeted everyone, exchanged the usual pleasantries, and joined the crowd. For the first few hours, everything was normal. Too normal, maybe. I don't know if it was the holiday buzz or just being around so much family, but I started picking up on these small, uncomfortable vibes. Nothing too obvious, just little things. Like how Michael avoided sitting near Bob, or how Bob seemed to be watching Michael a little too closely from across the room. When the two of them finally spoke, it was polite, but clipped. The kind of interaction that felt rehearsed, like both of them were putting in effort to avoid something boiling over. By the time we sat down for dinner, those little things started adding up. Michael barely touched his plate, and Bob kept making these offhand comments that were way too pointed to be casual. Something about responsibility and learning to stand on your own 2 feet. Michael didn't respond, but you could tell it was getting under his skin. Aunt Linda tried to keep the conversation flowing, steering it towards safer topics like football and travel plans. But there was this weird undercurrent of tension that no one could ignore. Later in the evening, while most of us were lounging around the living room, waiting for the countdown, I saw Michael step outside onto the back porch. He lit a cigarette, something I didn't even know he did, and just stood there, staring out into the yard. A few minutes later, Bob joined him. They were talking, quietly at first. But the longer they stood out there, the more animated their conversation became. I could see Michael gesturing, his hand gripping the cigarette like he was about to snap it in half, while Bob stood there with his arms crossed, looking unfazed. When they finally came back inside, it felt like the whole mood of the party had shifted. Bob's face was red, like he'd been yelling, and Michael looked like he was holding himself together by a thread. No one said anything, though. We just went back to pretending everything was fine. The night kept inching toward midnight, but the tension between Michael and Bob was hard to ignore now. It was in the way Michael's jaw clenched every time his dad said something, even to other people. It was in how Bob would shoot these cold, calculating looks toward Michael when he thought no one was paying attention. Everyone else was still laughing and drinking, but I couldn't shake this gut feeling that something bad was coming. Right before the countdown, Bob made his way to the kitchen, and Michael followed. At first, I figured they'd talk it out, maybe clear the air before the new year hit. But then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of voices raised just a little too high. The laughter in the living room faltered as people turned their heads toward the kitchen. Someone joked nervously, "Guess the champagne's kicking in." but no one laughed. I got up and made my way toward the noise. As I got closer, I could make out what they were arguing about. Money. Michael had borrowed a significant amount from Bob a while back and hadn't paid it back yet. Bob was laying into him about being irresponsible and ungrateful, while Michael fired back about how his dad never supported him and only cared about control. By the time I stepped into the doorway, Michael was standing rigid, his hands curled into fists at his sides. Bob stood across from him, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, looking calm in the most infuriating way possible. The kind of calm that could provoke someone even further. "You think I don't know what you're trying to do," Michael snapped. "You want me to fail so you can swoop in and say, 'I told you so.' That's all you've ever wanted." Bob didn't even flinch. He just shook his head and said, "You're a grown man, Michael. Start acting like one." That was it. That was the line that broke him. Michael lunged forward, shoving Bob hard enough to make him stumble back against the kitchen island. It all happened so fast. I shouted for them to stop, but neither of them even looked at me. Bob pushed back, and Michael lost his balance, knocking over a chair as he tried to steady himself. By now, the rest of the family had started gathering in the doorway, their faces frozen in shock. Then it happened. Bob took a step forward, raising his hand like he was going to point or jab a finger at Michael, but Michael reacted instinctively. He shoved Bob again, harder this time, and Bob went flying back. His head hit the corner of the countertop with a sickening crack before his whole body crumpled to the floor. For a moment, everything went silent. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Then came the chaos. Aunt Linda screamed, rushing forward to check on Bob. Grandma started sobbing, and my younger cousins were quickly ushered out of the room by their parents. Someone shouted for me to call 911, and my hands shook so badly that I almost dropped my phone trying to dial. Michael just stood there, frozen, staring at his father on the floor. His face was pale, his eyes wide with shock, like he couldn't believe what he'd just done. "I didn't mean," he started, but his voice broke, and he didn't finish the sentence. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but it felt like hours. Bob was unconscious, blood pooling under his head. They worked quickly to stabilize him, but the looks on their faces didn't inspire much hope. They loaded him onto a stretcher and rushed him to the hospital, leaving the rest of us standing there in stunned silence. The police showed up not long after. They questioned Michael right there in the kitchen, while the rest of us huddled in the living room, trying to piece together what had just happened. Michael was taken away that night, and we later found out that Bob had suffered a severe traumatic brain injury. He survived, but he wasn't the same. That night destroyed our family in ways I didn't think were possible. New Year's will never feel the same. Whenever I think about that moment, I wonder if any of us could have done something to stop it. Maybe if we'd stepped in sooner, or if we hadn't ignored the signs, things would have turned out differently. Now, every New Year's Eve, I find myself thinking the same thing. No holiday, no family tradition, is worth letting old wounds fester until they explode. It started off as a quiet New Year's Eve gathering at my place. Just me, my sister, and her boyfriend, and a couple of close friends. We weren't going for anything extravagant. A little champagne, the New Year's countdown on TV, and a laid-back vibe to ring in the new year. That was the plan. My apartment is small, so the group was perfect. I had cleaned up earlier in the day and set out some snacks on the coffee table. The champagne was chilling in the fridge. It was just supposed to be easy, a break from the usual craziness of the holidays. My sister arrived first with her boyfriend, both in good spirits. A couple of my friends followed not long after, including Tom, one of my oldest buddies. Tom looked off the moment he walked in. He was visibly annoyed, his jaw tight, and his tone short when we greeted him. I asked if he was okay, but he brushed it off, saying something about an argument he'd had with his girlfriend before leaving. I didn't press him on it. It wasn't the first time he'd shown up in a mood, and I figured he'd chill out once he had a drink or two and settled into the evening. Things stayed normal for a while. We laughed at some dumb segments on TV, shared stories from the year, and popped the first bottle of champagne about an hour before midnight. Tom had a drink in his hand almost right away. He wasn't much for conversation, though. He mostly hung back on the couch, scrolling through his phone and sipping his drink. As the evening went on, I noticed he was drinking faster than usual. By the time we hit midnight, Tom was clearly tipsy, his speech a little slurred, his movements unsteady. He was laughing at things that weren't all that funny and talking over people in a way that started to feel awkward. I tried to keep things light, hoping he'd mellow out before it became a problem. I didn't want to make a scene, especially with everyone else having a good time. But then, just after midnight, things shifted. Tom started pacing the room, holding an empty glass, and muttering under his breath. He asked where the next bottle was, and I told him to wait a second, but he ignored me. He headed straight for the fridge, yanked it open, and grabbed another bottle of champagne. I stepped in and said, "Hey, let's take it easy, okay? There's still plenty of time." Tom just waved me off, laughing a little too loudly. He fumbled with the foil wrapper, struggling to get it off. His hands were shaky, and he kept swearing under his breath. I was about to offer to help when he snapped at me. "I got it, man. Just back off." That's when I started feeling uneasy. It wasn't like Tom to get this aggressive, even when he was drunk. Tom finally managed to peel off the foil, but in his unsteady state, he dropped the bottle. It hit the floor with a loud crack and shattered, sending champagne and shards of glass across the room. Everyone froze for a moment, the cheerful energy draining out of the space as we all registered what had just happened. "Damn it!" Tom shouted, stumbling forward to pick up the pieces with his bare hands. "Wait! Don't—" I started, but it was too late. He'd already grabbed one of the larger pieces, and almost instantly he hissed in pain. A deep gash opened across his palm, and blood started pouring out, dripping onto the floor and soaking into the carpet. "Jesus, Tom, stop!" I said, rushing over. My sister's boyfriend grabbed some napkins from the table and handed them to me, but they were nowhere near enough to deal with the amount of blood. Tom staggered back, clutching his hand and looking pale, either from the alcohol or the sight of his own blood. I'm fine, he kept mumbling, but the blood wasn't stopping. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse. He sat down heavily on the couch, leaving a red smear on the armrest. Everyone was standing around, wide-eyed, unsure what to do. My sister tried to calm him down while I grabbed a towel from the bathroom and wrapped it around his hand, pressing hard to stop the bleeding. "Dude, we need to get you to the hospital," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Tom shook his head, slurring. "No, I'm good. It's nothing. Just give me another drink." "Are you kidding me right now?" I snapped. "Look at your hand, Tom. You're not drinking, you're going to the ER." It was a chaotic few minutes. Tom was in no condition to argue, but he still resisted as we tried to get him out the door. Blood kept seeping through the towel, and I could see that the cut was deep, deeper than I'd realized at first. My sister's boyfriend offered to drive, and after some struggling, we managed to get Tom into his car. The ride to the hospital was tense. Tom started sobering up a bit, but the pain was setting in, and he was groaning quietly in the back seat. I kept checking the towel, which was now completely soaked through. I was scared, but I tried not to show it. At the ER, things moved quickly. The nurses took one look at Tom's hand and rushed him back to a room. After what felt like forever, a doctor came out to talk to us. The glass had cut through some tendons in his palm, and he'd need surgery to repair the damage. The doctor said he might lose some mobility in his fingers if the recovery didn't go well. Hearing that hit me like a punch to the gut. All I could think about was how easily this could have been avoided. If I'd stopped him from drinking so much, if I'd kept a closer eye on him, if I'd just put the champagne bottles out of reach. I spent the rest of the night in the waiting room, replaying everything over and over in my head. My sister and her boyfriend had gone home by then, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. When Tom came out of surgery the next morning, he looked drained, both physically and emotionally. He didn't say much, just mumbled a quiet, "Thanks," before falling back asleep. It's been a few weeks since that night and things still don't feel normal. Tom's hand is in a brace and he's going to physical therapy, but there's no guarantee he'll regain full use of it. Every time I look at the spot on my carpet where the bloodstain wouldn't come out, I get this heavy feeling in my chest. It's weird how something so small, a single dropped bottle, can spiral into something so serious. I've learned my lesson, though. No more casual drinking at my place. No more brushing off bad vibes. Sometimes, it's the little things that turn into the biggest problems. I had been saving for months to throw an unforgettable New Year's Eve party at my new apartment. It was my first real home of my own, and I wanted everything to be perfect. I invited my best friend Josh, along with a small group of close friends. We had the food planned out: pizzas, charcuterie boards, cupcakes, and a few bottles of wine and champagne chilling in the fridge. I even set up a playlist for the night. Everyone was excited. It was going to be one of those nights you remember for years. Josh was the first to show up. He brought a small gift wrapped in shiny silver paper, a candle, he said with a little smirk. To warm up the place, he joked. I laughed and set it on the counter, touched that he had even thought to bring anything. Josh and I had been friends since college, and he'd been through thick and thin with me. Breakups, job troubles, everything. If there was anyone I trusted, it was him. The evening started off great. The music was on point, people were mingling, and there was a happy buzz in the air. Josh seemed a little quieter than usual, but I figured he was just tired or distracted. Around 10 p.m., he pulled me aside and asked if we could talk privately. We stepped into the small guest bedroom I used as a storage space. He shut the door behind him and said, "Hey man, I hate to even bring this up, but I was wondering if you could spot me like a couple $100, just until Monday." I blinked, caught off guard. Josh wasn't the kind of guy to ask for money, or at least he never had before. "Josh," I said slowly, "are you okay? What's going on?" Yeah, it's nothing major," he replied, brushing it off with a laugh. "Just got hit with some unexpected bills, you know. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. The thing is, I knew Josh was in debt." He'd mentioned it a few times over the past year. Credit cards, car payments, even a payday loan or two. I hesitated, feeling awkward. "I get it, man, but I can't do that right now. I've got my own stuff I'm trying to handle. Maybe we can figure something out later this week?" His face tightened, just for a second, before he plastered on a grin. "Yeah, sure, no worries. Forget I said anything." He walked out of the room before I could say anything else, and I stood there for a moment, feeling uneasy. Something about the way he looked at me before leaving, the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes, left me unsettled. I shook it off and went back to the party. Josh seemed fine, laughing and joking with everyone like usual. Midnight came, and we toasted to the new year, shouting over the music and the pop of champagne corks. It felt like a success, even if there was still that weird tension in the back of my mind. But then, around 1 a.m., Josh said he needed to head out. "Got an early morning tomorrow," he said with a shrug. He hugged me, told me the party was great, and left. The rest of us stayed up for another hour or two, and by the time I finally crawled into bed, I was exhausted. I barely registered the mess in the living room or the pile of empty glasses on the counter. I figured I'd deal with it all in the morning. When I woke up, the apartment was eerily quiet. Most of my friends had crashed on the couches or in the spare room, but they were already gone when I got up. The sunlight streaming through the blinds felt harsh, and my head pounded from the champagne. I stumbled into the kitchen to make coffee, and that's when I noticed it. My wallet wasn't where I'd left it. It was always on the kitchen counter, right next to the keys and my phone. I checked my coat pockets, the coffee table, even under the couch cushions, but it was nowhere to be found. A creeping sense of dread started building in my chest. Then I saw the open drawer in my desk. It was barely noticeable, but I always kept it closed. Inside were my work laptop and my tablet, except they weren't there anymore. My stomach dropped. I frantically searched the rest of the apartment, pulling open drawers and checking every corner, hoping I'd just misplaced them in the chaos of the party. But the longer I looked, the more obvious it became. My wallet and my gadgets were gone. I stood in the middle of the living room, heart pounding. My thoughts raced as I tried to piece it all together. Who would take my stuff? My friends? No way. These were people I trusted. People I'd known for years. But then I thought about Josh. He had left in the middle of the party. He'd asked for money earlier. And that look he gave me before he walked out, it hadn't felt right. I grabbed my phone and tried calling him. It rang twice before going straight to voicemail. I sent him a text. "Hey Josh, did you accidentally grab my wallet or laptop last night? I can't find them." I stared at the screen, waiting for the dots to appear. Nothing. Minutes passed, and I called him again. This time, the call didn't even ring. It went straight to voicemail. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I opened Instagram and searched for his profile. Gone. I checked Facebook and found the same thing. His account was completely deactivated. By now, I was panicking. I called a couple of friends who had been at the party, asking if they'd seen Josh leave or noticed anything strange. One of them, Emma, paused before answering. "Yeah, he said something about an emergency. He left kind of quickly." "Why? What's going on?" I explained everything. How my wallet and gadgets were missing. How Josh had asked for money. How he wasn't answering his phone. Emma was quiet for a moment before she said, "I don't want to jump to conclusions, but that's really weird. Maybe you should call the police?" The thought of calling the cops on my best friend made me sick. But I didn't have any other options. I reported the theft, gave them Josh's name, and told them everything I knew. Later that day, I checked my bank account. My heart sank when I saw multiple charges I didn't recognize. Over $1,000 was gone. I quickly froze my cards, but the damage was done. The next few days were a blur of frustration and disbelief. Josh had vanished. His phone stayed disconnected, and no one else had heard from him. Then, a week later, I got a call from the police. Josh had been caught trying to pawn a laptop that matched the description of mine. When they questioned him, he confessed to taking my things, and admitted he'd been stealing from others too. He was drowning in debt from gambling, and had used me, his supposed best friend, as an easy target. I felt a mix of anger and heartbreak. This was someone I'd trusted completely, someone I considered family. To find out he'd betrayed me like this was devastating. In the end, I got my laptop and tablet back, but the money was gone, and so was any hope of salvaging our friendship. Josh was charged with theft and fraud, and I haven't spoken to him since. Looking back, I wish I'd seen the signs earlier. There were little things, the excuses, the nervous energy, that I ignored because I didn't want to believe the worst about him. If there's one thing I learned, it's this. Trust is fragile, and sometimes the people you think you know best are the ones who can hurt you the most. That New Year's party was supposed to be a fresh start. Instead, it was a harsh lesson in betrayal that I'll never forget.